All right. Hello, and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker. And today is an interesting episode. It's something I haven't quite done before. It's kind of related to a personal issue. So, some of you might know that for the last couple months or so, I've been a part of an investigation committee into investigating certain allegations against my old pastor at Midland Park Baptist Church, Pastor Steve Eusebio, and we've been kind of investigating certain issues. We were invited by current good standing members of that church to form a committee and look into some of the claims for and against Pastor Steve's behavior as the pastor of that church. And as such, now that we've concluded that investigation and we've made our final report and that sort of thing, I just wanted to do a bit of a show on edifying lessons that I've learned and some of what happened during the investigation, but how do we extrapolate that? What are lessons we can learn as Christians to differentiate a true church, a godly pastor versus are we in a cult-like environment, or are we following a cult leader, and some of the issues that came up there. So we're going to be looking at things ranging from the local versus universal church, submission to pastors. What does that mean? Issues of church discipline, Matthew 18, how do we follow that process? All of that stuff. Before we get into it, I just want to introduce my guests. So we have immediately to my right, we have David Russell from Faith Unaltered. Hey, David.
Hey, buddy. How are you?
I'm good. Do you want to just take a couple minutes? What have you been up to on your end, on your show?
Oh, man, we've been covering a range of topics. Soon we'll be having my surprise, which it's not really going to be a surprise, but it's going to be on the paranormal and stuff. And I've got an archbishop coming in for that. So it's going to be pretty cool. But yeah, other than that, personally, I've got 3 of my wines in a national competition right now. And I just got 31 bottles of rosé that just came in. So, me and my wine. So
Yep. Nice. All right, cool. So, and immediately under him, we have the atheist, David Johnson from Skeptics and Seekers. Hey, David, how's it going?
Never better. Thanks for inviting me.
No problem. And do you want to just take a couple minutes on your end? What's new on Skeptics and Seekers? What are you doing over there?
Well, besides the great programming that we do every week, we have been doing for actually some time now, couple months, a daily show, Skeptics and Seekers Sunday Sermon Shorts. And the goal of this show is to do anywhere from 3 to 10 minutes in the morning before I go to work, or in the evening after I get home, whenever I get a chance to record. And we're doing, we're taking a look at things that are in the news. I'm looking pretty much exclusively at Christian news, things that Christians are talking about, and just giving real live examples of this is what Christianity is, boots on the ground, butts in the pews, Christianity, this is what they're saying, this is what they're doing. Sometimes it's quite outrageous, sometimes not always outrageous, but it's just a look at Christianity in the news from the perspective of a skeptic. And so that's a daily. It's in the same podcast feed. I do put them up on the board, Skeptics and Seekers. .squarespace.com. Log in your Discuss account, Discuss Way, or just whatever the podcast feed you normally get for us on.
All right, awesome. And last but not least, my friend Dr. Tony Costa. Hey, Tony, how's it going?
I'm doing well, Dale. And let me just say that was a great opening to your podcast. I really liked it.
Oh, thank you. Well, David Russell deserves the credit. He's the one who made that for me. So,
no. Cheers, David. That's awesome.
Awesome.
Thank you, sir.
Awesome. All right, cool. So yeah, Tony, obviously you're kind of limited on time. So I want to focus the first 20 minutes kind of on your views on some of the main topics. So do you want to just kind of explain to the audience, okay, on this broad question of a church versus a cult, what do you see as the main differences? How do we differentiate a church from a cult?
Sure. Well, the word cult is subject to a number of various interpretations based on context. You can talk about the cult of the Virgin Mary, for example, referring to the veneration of Mary, where the word cult there can refer to a religious context. When we use the word cult in Christian circles, the way Walter Martin used it in his book Kingdom of the Cults, we use it in an ecclesiastical / theological context, and what that means generally is that a cult is a group that differs from mainstream Christianity in that it denies the core fundamental doctrines of historic Christianity, like the Trinity, the deity of Christ, the atonement of Christ on the cross, salvation through the blood of Christ, the resurrection, bodily resurrection, the ascension of Christ, his virgin birth, his second coming, etc. A lot of the cults that we have seen since the 19th century generally deny these core fundamentals. And so from a theological perspective, these groups are called non-Christian cults. Now, the word cult can also refer to a group that is an abusive group. It doesn't have to be necessarily religious, but in most cases it is. And so the word cult can refer to certain groups that use mind control, that use suggestive thinking, and also the word cult. We can use the word cult-like. There are indeed cult-like churches that unfortunately are using the same psychological maneuvers that a lot of these cults are using. So a very good book was written in, I think it was the mid-'80s, late 1980s, by Ronald Enroth, and the title of his book was Churches That Abuse. And in that book, he describes what are some of the signs of various churches that abuse, some of the traits to look out for. And what you find is that the traits that a number of these churches have employed are, shockingly, the very same traits that cults employ. And so even though we distinguish a cult from a church today, we need to understand and be on guard to the fact that there are churches that do use cult-like tendencies. And therefore, this could involve controlling speech. It could involve shutting down critical thinking or critical questions. It can involve psychological damage to people and so forth. And therefore, we're not saying that churches are immaculate or perfect. But what I am saying is that there are, and I have seen them myself, there are churches that definitely use cult-like practices.
Gotcha. Yeah, it's important what you say, because I think there are different aspects or ways one could be considered a cult. And you mentioned there's the doctrinal, where you deny one or more of the essential doctrines, but there's also those behavioral aspects, right? Like shutting down critical thinking and that sort of. Okay. All right, cool. And just out of just as sort of a quick notion, David Russell, is that your sort of take on the general difference as well?
Yeah, and like I said to you earlier, there's obviously a legal definition as well. But yeah, I pretty much agree with Tony.
Okay, cool. And David Johnson, David J, coming from an atheist perspective, but you were a former member of the Church of Christ and that sort of thing. What's your sort of very quick general take on what Tony was saying there? Is there a way to differentiate between church and cult in your view? Or
yeah, well, first of all, I was a Christian a lot longer than I was an atheist, and so I don't think this is something that is informed very well by whether you're a Christian or an atheist, because I think it's something that touches us all. And I think that atheists, skeptics, people on this side of the aisle are just as susceptible to cult-like behavior and being sucked into cult-like things that aren't religious. So religion isn't the only place where this exists, and so I don't think that either side has an advantage over the other. And if one side is pointing their fingers and saying, look at those stupid people, I think that there's something for you to maybe learn from this podcast. Now, I think the thing that I like most about Tony's run-up is using the term cult-like. I actually think using the term cult is not very useful in a lot of discussion, because there's so many different meanings and so many different flavors to it. And, you can easily point the finger at someone and say, you see, that's a cult. you're a cult. No, you're a cult. And you both have slightly different ideas about it. And so I think we can cut through some of that by using cult-like behavior and cult-like tendencies just to kind of cut through that a little bit.
All right. Interesting. Yeah, that's a good point that I think we'll discuss later on when we have more time, that the word cult or cult-like can apply outside of religious context potentially as well. So, okay, that's great. All right. So Tony, kind of turning back to you. And so one of the main issues that we found during the investigation that we found very frustrating as former members or former attendees, but now we're external to that local body, is this issue between the universal versus the local church. And Pastor Steve at Midland Park, he capitalizes on this and stresses that, look, the local church is all that matters. That's where, you can deal. If you've got a problem, you deal with it strictly internally at the local church level. Outsiders have no say. They don't matter at all in terms of anything like that. So it's what's your take on the local versus universal church? Is that something that can be used to disqualify outsiders from having any say to do with the church at all?
Well, let me just say that the universal local church is an idea that is very ancient in the history of Christianity. The early Christian fathers like Augustine understood the difference between the local church and what he called the mystical church, that is the universal Catholic. And I'm using the word Catholic church here in the sense of universal, not necessarily Roman Catholic. And so the understanding that the body of Christ is one and it is universal, but at the same time, there is the local manifestation of that body in what we call the local church, and that refers to the local assembly of believers. But in the Baptist tradition from which your church came from, and let me say just for the record that I was not part of this investigation, and so this is not anything I'm saying that is personal against the pastor. I'm just speaking as an outsider on the questions you're asking. I just want to make that clear for the record. In the Baptist tradition, there is the idea of the autonomous nature of the church. And so in Baptist history, the local church is autonomous in that it is self-ruling. But here's the issue. Within the local church, you need to have a plurality of elders or pastors or overseers. That's clearly taught in the pastoral epistles of 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus. And the reason why we need a plurality of elders is to keep checks and balances. It's to keep one of them from usurping the authority over the others. Now, in Christian history, this is what we see with the papacy, where one bishop, the Bishop of Rome, claims ascendancy or claims supremacy over the other bishops and claims to be the supreme pontiff. And this is where you have, of course, the emergence of the papacy. That was not so in first century Christianity. The reason why we need a plurality of elders is precisely for that reason, is that if you have one guy running the show, you are going to have abuse, you are going to have authoritarianism, and you know the old saying, Dale, that absolute power corrupts absolutely. Yeah. And therefore, even though I do agree as a Baptist in the autonomous nature of the local church, I do believe that unless you have a plurality of elders, you really cannot be functioning as a church. And of course, you need deacons as well. And these elders are to be held accountable to one another. And so that is why, if there's ever a conflict that arises, it is up for the elders to settle this. I mean, here's just a quick example. When the whole COVID thing struck, and John MacArthur's church in California they were challenging the government's mandates. They had meetings with the elders. This wasn't John unilaterally making this decision. There were elder meetings, and they had to come to a very, very clear consensus. So in terms of the outside churches, you can get consultants, you can get consulting pastors, or you can get elders to come on board to maybe interview a serious situation. There's no problem with that. But even if you do have a very strict Baptistic autonomous church structure, you need to have a plurality of elders, and that is a very clearly biblically taught doctrine in terms of ecclesiology.
Exactly. Yeah, you need that system of checks and balances. And I'm glad with what you said, because I attend a Presbyterian church now, but I'm a Baptist at heart. I believe in the independency of the churches, but there is that issue of, look, the biblical model, it's not an isolationist policy. It's an interdependent.
Right.
So for example, we see Acts 15, certain local churches had certain issues where, okay, they could appeal to outsiders to be consultants and that. So yeah, like, do you see that there is that role for an interdependency within the early church as well?
Are you asking me or David?
Oh, no, asking you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. I mean, in terms of Acts 15, where you have the first council, the first church council, the Jerusalem Council of AD 50, you clearly see that the issue of the Gentiles coming to the church and whether Gentiles should be circumcised, and and then Paul comes, of course, with Barnabas, and he lays his case before the council. It's very important to understand that in that council you have a plurality of elders. It says that the apostles and the elders came together, and they consulted and they prayed about it, and they came to a decision. And so what you don't find is you don't have, interestingly enough, this is something that I tell my Roman Catholic friends, it's not Peter that has the leadership in that council. It's actually James, the Lord's brother. And he's not acting as a pope, but he's acting as a first among equals, as it were. And so even in Acts 15, it's very clear that it's not a decision that is made by one individual, but that it is a decision that is made collectively by the apostles and the elders.
Gotcha. All right, cool. So, okay, so moving on to the next issue for you here, Tony. Again, just so the audience understands, again, Tony's got a conference that he's going to be speaking at, so that's why I'm kind of focusing on him in this early part. But one thing that was brought up again and again during our investigation was the principles in Matthew 18. If you've got a problem with your brother, first you take it to them. Then if it's not solved, you bring before 2 or 3 others. And if it's still not solved, then you take it to the local whole church to decide as a whole. Now, I'm sort of curious. Obviously, this is in the Bible, so this is a biblically mandated process. But are there any limitations on Matthew 18? Are there contexts where maybe it doesn't apply? Like if you have leadership or others in charge, that when you take the problem to them, they're not dealing with it. Let me just ask generally, like, are there ways around the Matthew 18? Is it something that you have to follow? And if you don't follow it, it's all over. How do Christians apply Matthew 18?
Yeah. Well, Matthew 18 is a very important text, because in Matthew 18 and Matthew 16, where you have the confession of Peter that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of the living God, it's in Matthew 16 and then into 18 that Jesus first starts talking about the church, the ecclesia. In fact, it's only in Matthew that the word church appears, and it appears in Matthew 16 and in 18, where Jesus says, like you said, if there's a problem, you go to your brother. If he doesn't listen, take 2 witnesses with you. If he doesn't listen, then you bring it to the whole church. There's the mention of the word church there. And so Matthew 18 is the modus operandi of church discipline. And what we need to understand is that there are a number of things that are grounds for excommunication. So the last resort in Matthew 18 is that if he does not listen to the church, then he has to be expelled and treated as a publican. And so or a tax collector, which basically says as an outsider. But the things that qualify for expelling or for excommunication from the church are, for example, sexual immorality is one of them. If there's sexual immorality that is committed not only by the pastor but by a church member, that is something that is grievous enough to lead to expulsion from the church if it's unrepentant. And the other one is heresy. Mm-hmm. But also there's others. I mean, there's of course abuse. and the one thing we need to understand about abuse, Dale, is that abuse is basically equivalent to control. Abuse has to do with controlling people's minds. In spousal abuse, you've got a spouse controlling the other spouse by either physical force, assault, or by mental manipulation and so forth. But in the case of Matthew 18, when an elder is acting out of line, and when an elder is abusive, which which basically is where we get the cult-like tendencies here. The way that this is treated is someone goes to that person, whether it's a pastor or not, and confront that person with their sin. If they don't repent, then you take 2 witnesses with you. And if they still don't repent, then it has to be brought before the church, and that usually involves providing a report, a summary of the alleged charges against the pastor. And if the pastor does not listen to the church, then the church needs to move to have the pastor expelled. And so that's generally the basis of discipline that Jesus himself laid down for his church. And when that procedure is not followed, then we end up having disastrous consequences where the abuse continues. The pastor feels vindicated that he can do whatever he wants, and then of course that just leads to more abuse and more fracturing in the church.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think that's key. What you just said there too, because this church discipline is for all Christians, including the leaders. It's not
Right.
just a one-way street here, right? And that's one thing that also came up that I also wanted to go over as a main topic segment, because during our investigation, this issue came up with a lot of people in the church. I think it's Hebrews 13, right, where it talks about submitting to your pastors. And I would hear this over and over again. It's not my place to question the pastor, or once he's made up his mind on a theological issue. Look, he's been to seminary, he's got training. I don't. It's not my place to question,
Right.
but to submit.
Right.
What's your take on it? Okay, it's in the Bible. We are to submit
Yeah.
to pastors, but is it this blind obedience? Or what?
No, definitely not. I mean, that's an example of an isolationist reading of scripture. So you can't read passages in isolation, right? We believe in tota scriptura, that we believe in the principle of comparing scripture with scripture. So you don't just isolate one passage. Now, of course, in Hebrews 13, it says to obey your leaders because they care for your souls and so forth and so on. But scripture also says to prove all things and to hold fast to what is good. And the scriptures also say that if a charge is brought before an elder, it has to be done by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses. And so that does not abscond elders. And when I say an elder is the equivalent of a pastor. By bringing a charge against an elder, and you have witnesses to back it up, that clearly does not abscond the elder from responsibility. After all, we don't believe that pastors are infallible. We don't hold to the infallibility of the Pope here, as Roman Catholics do when the Pope speaks concerning dogma and doctrine, ex cathedra. So we need to understand that the moment we say we cannot question our leaders, there's where the cult-like tendency comes in, because that is exactly what we find in certain groups like Jehovah's Witnesses and others, where even to criticize the organization is tantamount to a trial for excommunication. And so that, I think, is an example of an abuse of scripture, reading scripture in an abusive manner to justify abusive behavior. So no, Hebrews 13 does not mean you do not question your leaders.
Awesome. Yeah, I totally agree with that on my end and everything like that. So, okay. So I think, yeah, the last main topic that I'm going to be discussing as well is, okay, so we kind of looked at the differences between cults and churches, and that looking at a pastor versus a cult leader, what are, according to the Bible, what are the pastoral qualifications that we need to look for, according to the Bible?
Yeah, according to the Bible, we are clearly told what elders are supposed to do. And so, according to 1 Timothy chapter 3, the Apostle Paul says there that whoever sets his heart on being an elder or an overseer, which is the same thing, he lays down a number of qualifications. So the overseer must be above reproach. That is to say, not that they're infallible or sinless, but that they are to have a respectful disposition. They're to be the husband of one wife, so a one-woman man. He's not supposed to be someone who is marrying and divorcing, remarrying, and so forth. He's to be temperate. He's to be self-controlled. He's to be respectable, hospitable, able to teach. He's not to be given to drunkenness. In other words, not an alcoholic. He's not to be violent, but he's to be gentle. And also, he's not to be quarrelsome. but to be peaceful towards his congregants and not a lover of money. And also, he must be able to manage his own family well. So that's a very important point. That if he can't run his own family, then by extension, from the lesser to the greater, how can he manage the house of God? Um, he also must not be a recent convert. In other words, he must be qualified, and also he must have a good reputation with outsiders. And so those qualifications are pretty clear. That an elder is supposed to mirror the chief shepherd, Jesus Christ. And Christ was gentle. He loved his sheep. He gave his life for his sheep. And so under shepherds, which is a title we use for pastors, under shepherds are to do the same thing. They are to care, to love, to gently counsel. They're to be above reproach, and temperate, and so forth. So if those qualifications are missing in an elder or a pastor, that is a recipe for disaster.
Okay, one follow up from me then, because so let's say a pastor given pastor fulfills all of them except for one. Maybe he's quick tempered. Like how are these to be applied? Are they all
Yeah,
necessary? If you're missing even one, or if you're
right,
struggling with one, you're not a pastor. Or how does it work?
right, right. So we're not talking about perfection here or sinlessness, but that's why we need a plurality of elders to
Hmm.
hold each other accountable. And so in that context, a fellow elder or fellow elders will come alongside of that pastor and say, "Listen, brother, there seems to be an issue here with your temper and so forth. Let's talk. Let's deal with this because this does not reflect well to the people that we look after." And so this is why I said that unless you have a plurality of elders, you're going to end up again with an authoritarian, abusive leader. And so that is why, and we see examples of this in the New Testament as well, um, where the Paul holds Peter accountable for his weakness when he compromises with his Gentile converts in Galatians 2. Um, and so this is why the plurality of elders is an absolute must, because we need to keep each other accountable. We need the checks and balances. Um, and unfortunately, when that doesn't happen, here's the problem, Dale, is that when you've got a team of yes men, and this is the unfortunate part, is some senior pastors will accumulate to themselves
Yep.
yes men or like-minded individuals that are friends. That is a major problem because
Yep.
now you're stacking the deck. And ideally, what you should have elders that are not your best friend, if you will. They're not they're not your golfing buddy.
Or your
Um,
life.
and so this is why we need. I cannot stress this enough. We need a plurality of elders in the church.
Awesome. All right, cool. So yeah, just before you go, I want to turn it over to the co-host. Do you guys have like a couple questions? David Johnson, we'll start with you. Do you have like one or two questions for Tony's take on things, given what he said, or?
Many. I could do a show on church polity, and maybe Dale, you and I will sit around and geek out about church polity on a microphone. But I would say that what you've outlined, Tony, is a lot like the way my church would have read it as well. But there are some things that would raise some questions. I think it's a lot less simplistic than that in the Bible, and the proof of that is you've got a lot of churches that do it different ways and have different thoughts about it. So just one example of that. In fact, I'll give two. If there's a church, and let's say they have a plurality of elders, and let's say that plurality is two. They have two elders, and they have a preacher who is not an elder. And one of the elders, because of old age, bad health, whatever, kicks the bucket. Now you no longer have a plurality of elders. Does the church just fold up, go into, become merged into another church nearby? Or do they carry on as a church without a plurality of elders. And as you know, many churches have no quote unquote elders. They just have a preacher in charge who is often called the pastor. I'm not entirely sure why, but that doesn't represent a plurality. So that's just one example of where this gets a little bit messy. Another example, I'll be even quicker with this one, would be in the case of church discipline. A church has gone through whatever steps to excommunicate or disfellowship someone. We would have said disfellowship in my denomination. And so there are a multiplicity of congregations of that denomination in the city. Well, that person's been disfellowshipped. So they just go to the church next door. Are they disfellowshipped there? If the church welcomes them with open arms, despite them being disfellowships, and the elders have communicated this disfellowship with the other churches, but the other churches say, to heck with that. We think you're wrong. They're welcome here. Does that disfellowship even mean anything? Or do other churches have to agree with or, somehow affirm that disfellowship? And if so, that means that churches aren't quite as autonomous and independent as sometimes churches like to be. So those couple of examples, like I said, I could talk all day about church polity, are just a couple of cogs in the wheels. And so if you want to comment on those, fine. If not, that's fine too.
Yeah. Well, let me first say that the plurality of elders, again, is an absolute must. And that is why churches should be always, I would say plurality of elders. At the very least, they should have 3 elders. Now, when I say elders, I'm including the pastor. Pastors are elders. Elders are pastors. They should have at the minimum 3. Ideally more. Of course, depending on the size of the congregation. If you have a large congregation, I know churches that have up to 6 to 8 elders, depending on the size of the church. In the meantime, churches should also be training men to be elders in the process, because, as you said, there are cases where certain gentleman gets old and dies, and of course, that role should be filled in. And so what I would say to that is most definitely you should have a minimum of 3, ideally. In the case of excommunication or being disfellowshipped.
Well, before you go there, though,
yeah.
If you, for whatever reason, plane crash, you had 6 and you're down to 1.
Yeah.
Does the church continue or does it not continue?
Yeah. Well, you have to take it on a case-by-case basis. So in a case like that you just described, in a case of an airplane crash, obviously that is an unexpected, unforeseen circumstance. I think what the church would do in that situation is they would have to go. Obviously, they're not going to shut the doors down because of that accident, but they should be in the process of electing 2 other elders as soon as they can. In terms of disfellowshipping, if someone moves into a new church, the pastor there should be asking, where did you come from? What church were you part of? And what the pastor should do is contact the former church and ask the pastor, is this man or woman in good standing? There are cases where people have been disfellowshipped and gone to another church, and the pastor of the new church contacted the other church, and the pastor says, well, that person is under discipline for adultery or whatever it may be. And so I see your point, David, because I mean, we've got denominationalism, we've got different denominations. And so some denominations are just, just open arms, just come in and we welcome you, come as you are. We don't care where you've come from. And that, in my opinion, is a church that is functioning in my opinion, in an unbiblical fashion, because there are cases where people who've been disfellowshipped just go to another church for whatever reason. So this is where it goes back, and we come full circle to Dale's question about the universal church, and that is that even though as Baptists we believe in the autonomous nature of the church, there is a sense in which we are still part of that universal church. And in cases of being disfellowshipped, I think that there is a responsibility from the pastor of another church to make sure that this person is in good standing, and this again raises the question of church membership and so forth. So I know it is a thorny issue. I know there's a lot of cracks that people can fall through in this one, but ideally, that's how I would approach it.
I know we're limited on time. I want to give David just very quickly, because this is interesting on this issue of disfellowship. Because one of the things we were investigating is people have been disfellowshipped from a church, but let's say a church has an abusive pastor or leader. That's kind of making them a little bit beholden, right? Like, okay, of course they're going to say something bad about whether it's true or not. What's the process if you left the church because the pastor is abusing church discipline or something like that? If you don't mind.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, if you left the church, if you weren't disfellowshipped, you just left because the pastor was being abusive, and you joined another church, you're not disfellowshipped. You just decided, I've had enough of this. I'm not going to take this abuse. And no different than a woman who's been abused by her husband decides to leave and separate. But if the pastor has falsely disfellowshipped the person, remember that the grounds for disfellowshipping or excommunication have to be sexual sin, teaching heresy, or abusive behavior towards, let's say, other members of the church, or abuse towards the pastoral staff, and so forth. So you don't just disfellowship people over lying. Oh, we caught you lying. And so, something like Calvin's Geneva, where you had a very theocratic hold on the people's lives.
Yeah.
And no disrespect, Calvin, I think he was one of the greatest reformers. But a very, something like the Puritans, in a sense, loved the Puritans, but we also saw the abuses of the Salem witch trials as well. But you don't just disfellowship somebody willy-nilly. You don't just say, oh, he was watching pornography and therefore we're going to get rid of him. These have to be serious, grievous sins, of which people have been removed. And so, and that's why this principle of being disfellowshipped and excommunication should not be taken lightly. It is, and that's why there's a process to it. It's not just, you just jump the gun and kick the person out. There's a 3-stage process that is laid down in Matthew 18.
Awesome. All right, David Russell, I'll let you ask a final question to Tony Costa before you.
Well, I'm going to respect his time. I pretty much agreed with everything he said, so I'm on that kick as well. So I just want to respect his time because I know he's already 10 minutes over what he wanted to be. So.
That's okay. I'm just enjoying it so much that it's kind of hard to let go.
I hear you.
Yeah. Well, okay. Well, yeah. You're welcome to stay as long as you want. Just okay. Cool. So, okay. So at that point, then that's my questions for Tony, kind of thing. So I do want to turn it to others on the panel as well. So let's start with the first main topic that I asked Tony about. Differentiate what the heck is the difference between a cult versus a church? Is there a difference, and that sort of thing? So. David Russell, I'll start with you. Do you want to kind of give your full opening on what's your take about that question? How do we differentiate between the two?
Well, my head's in another topic right now, but
yeah, sorry. The way it is, I did all the topics at once.
I know, right? Yeah. I'm thinking about the plurality of elders and stuff like that. So
I don't mind going first if you want some extra time to think.
Yeah, I mean, go ahead, David. You're not gonna. I mean, Tony, I pretty much am on par with almost everything he said. So, I mean, my answer's not going to be that much different.
Gotcha. Okay.
So,
well, okay, I'm going to. I'll just say that for me, and this is not something I'm going to get bogged down on. Dale and I have talked about this a little bit privately over the years, but it becomes very difficult to just describe a clear difference between a church and a cult. And I think the more pieces of definition you have, the harder it is to differentiate. So this is an example of 4 things that I picked up from Andrew. Andrew is a seminarian in the church that I grew up with, and they used to have studies on this, and so this was 4 of their talking points. So a cult could be identified as something with secret writings or a special language or some type of unique election or isolation. And I would add a fifth one of extreme exclusivity. All of these things, and this is just a list of five, you can, at least one of those things, you can apply to just about all churches. And once again, the longer the list, you're going to find one or two things where you're going to have to kind of plead away and say, yes, well, it may look like this with the mainstream church, but the difference is, and so that's where it becomes really hard to describe. I know that for myself, if I just had to narrow it down to two things, I would say that cult-like behavior is where we have this extreme sense of exclusivity. We are in and everyone is out, and we're in because of this special thing. And so, that's one of the things. And the other thing would be one from Andrew's list, which is isolation. We are the only family you have, and we are the most important family you have, and we are the friends that you should have. And anything outside of the group should be, confirmed by the group, and it's the thing that kind of separates you from your society. Once again, both of these things can be said of mainstream churches when taken too far, and so and they can also be said of, like I said, of other organizations that are not churches. But those would be two things that I would put near the top of the list of cult-like attributes.
Yeah, so Dale, I would also like piggyback on what everybody's saying here, and just add to that. There's also like recruitment aspects to it that I think David pointed out. But some of these guys, they'll actually buy you a car, or they'll do a lot to entice you. And once you see those type of things, there's kind of like the red flags that should go up. Especially when they start trying to isolate you. I mean, some of them will even give you a wife within the cult, and I mean, I remember I was part of a cult-like church when I first started out for the first 5 years of my Christian walk. And they really, really opened their arms and were really nice. So a lot of people were attracted to that. But as time went on, they were teaching things that just weren't biblical. They were allowing people to get in the pulpit that would, just speak outlandishly, and teach outlandish things, and I think some of those are also clear indicators, just like everybody's been saying, of cult-like behavior and things that even can turn into a cult. I mean, the aspect of isolation is huge. I mean, you saw what happened in Waco. They lived on a compound, isolated themselves from society. So I mean, there's a lot of those different things that I think do go into it. So
yeah, that's a huge issue too that I noticed. I'll talk about it later in terms of my experience, but there was this isolationist policy, right? Don't talk to that person. He's Satan, or he's being used by the devil. Don't talk to them. Don't listen to them. Just, don't engage and stuff like that. There is this separation or isolationist thing. Tony, I don't think I asked you about that. Like, what's your thoughts on that isolationist thing? Do you think that's an indicative aspect that to watch?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just to add on to what David Russell said, there's the idea of love bombing, where they give you, like he said, a wife, or they love bomb you on everything. They provide, especially in third world countries, which I have seen personally myself, where they provide resources, provide money, provide food on the grounds that they convert to the particular cult. But isolationism is another one. For example, Jehovah's Witnesses practice shunning. And what that means is if a member leaves the group, even if it's a mother or a brother or a sister or a son or a daughter, and I've seen cases like this. I know many ex-Jehovah's Witnesses who their parents have not spoken to them in over 20 years. Simply because they've left. And this is a form of isolating the person. It's a form of shaming them, make them feel guilty, that unless they return, they're basically fodder for the fires of hell, and that they will come under satanic attack. They won't survive Armageddon, et cetera, et cetera. And so this idea of isolation is part of what's called the shunning process. You shun members who don't follow the leader, and so it's very damaging, and it's very it's not just damaging, but it's visceral. I knew a Jehovah's Witness man who was barred from seeing his daughter, who was suffering from a blood cancer. And he was trying to save her life by getting her a blood transfusion, and Jehovah's Witnesses don't believe in receiving blood. And so his daughter ended up, unfortunately, passing away. And so you could see the far-reaching effects of this type of abuse. So it is one of the characteristics of cult-like groups, and it still goes on today.
Hey, but Tony, can I ask you just you directly, because
Sure.
I may not have another opportunity to communicate with you this directly, unless you want to come on the show, in which we can take some time to communicate. On that very subject of shunning, how is that different from what Paul taught in the Corinthian letters? Because there was a situation in the Corinthian church, and it's kind of shortcutting for the audience, and discommunication was the thing, and Paul said, do not bid such a person Godspeed, do not fellowship with him, with such a person do not even eat.
That's correct.
That could very much divide a family as well, because he didn't make any exceptions with family and so forth.
Yes, correct. I agree with you. The only difference is that in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, many New Testament scholars believe that Paul is addressing that very person in 1 Corinthians 5, who was a man who was having sexual affairs with his stepmother, and he remained unrepentant, and Paul commanded that this person be removed from the Christian congregation. However, in 2 Corinthians 2, Paul talks about restoring the one who has fallen and praying for them so that they will not grieve without hope. And so there is a sense in which you don't completely shun them in terms of you don't talk to them at all, but you can remind them. You could say to someone who's been removed from the church that, look, I still love you. I'm praying for you. I'm praying for your restoration. In 1 Corinthians 5 and 2 Corinthians 2, I think it's very clear that the main purpose of discipline, of church discipline, is to see repentance. It's to see the person ultimately restored. And so we're not claiming that we are made up of perfect people. There was a heresy back in the 5th century called Donatism that St. Augustine fought vociferously against. And the Donatists were saying that unless you were basically perfect people, you couldn't be in the church. And Augustine responded by saying that the church is filled with Judases and filled with all types of broken people. And so the ultimate aim of disfellowshipping or excommunication is to pray for that person to ultimately be restored and to come back. In cases of Jehovah's Witnesses and other groups that I have seen, this shunning goes on indefinitely. So I think it's important for us to mention that restoration is an integral part of the principle of excommunication in the New Testament.
All right, cool. So one thing I wanted to do, because I had my friend Jamie Castro, who actually kind of has a ministry specializing in spiritual abuse, and I had him on my show last week. So I just want to play like a 10-minute clip. He's kind of covering the same things that Tony and David J and David R have been talking about, but I just want to play that 10-minute clip because I thought he had a good answer as well. So
Del, if I may just interject, I do have to leave.
Okay.
Because I have to, I've got to get ready in about 5 minutes. So unfortunately, I won't be able to hear the clip. Unfortunately.
No problem. You can watch the video. I'll send you the link afterwards so you can.
Yeah.
Watch
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And Tony, get in touch with Dale so that you can come on the show because he knows.
Yeah, that'd be great, David. Yeah, absolutely, right. That'd be great, David, and David Russell.
Yes, it was a pleasure.
It was a pleasure. Yeah. And so, guys, it's great mingling with you guys, and have a great weekend.
Good night.
You too, sir.
All right. For your insights.
All right. Blessings. Bye now. Bye-bye.
All right. So let me bring up the clip here from Jamie Castro, and Jamie himself might show up at some point during this stream, so he might be able to speak for himself. But in the meantime, let's take a listen to what he said in this 10-minute clip. Are you guys seeing that?
Yeah.
I had my screen brightness down to conserve battery, but I've turned it up a bit. So yes.
Can you guys hear that?
David, your character.
Wait, so guys, can you hear it? What it's saying?
I cannot hear it.
No words, Dale.
You guys can't hear it?
No.
Okay, so let me.
Look at that face where he paused it. That's the devil right there. You're seeing him.
Oh, shut up, Mr. Russell. Okay, also share audio. They changed this thing. Okay, so share audio. Beautiful. So that's popping up. Can you guys see that?
No. Okay, there
David, can you bring it up from the queue?
Yep, it's there.
Yeah.
It's there?
Yep.
Okay, all right.
Look at that smile.
I muted, and you guys can hear it?
Yeah, go ahead.
Myself by accident. Okay, cool. So I want to kind of transition into, let's look at that first topic, this issue of spiritual abuse, because this is so important today, as you and I know, kind of thing.
Yeah.
So, do you want to just kind of take a couple seconds? First of all, can you explain, okay, look, what is the difference? What are the essentials of the true Christian faith? And what is the purpose of the real church supposed to be?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know if you want me to list all the essentials. I do have a website where they are listed at churchwatchdog.webadore.com. So we actually list all the essentials. There's quite a few because there's doctrinal essentials, there's moral essentials of the Christian faith. But just to answer briefly or generally, the difference between a good church or a bad church is the difference between independence and interdependence. When we look at the New Testament, the New Testament churches were interdependent with each other for several reasons: for accountability, for healthy doctrine, for spiritual edification, and so we do see examples. For instance, in 3 John. Where there was a church that became independent, and it ran into all kinds of problems where they began to weaponize and abuse the scriptures. So that's one area. The other area would be the difference between liberty and legalism, where legalism is going beyond what the scripture teaches, in some cases taking away from what the scripture teaches. And we know that the Pharisees were notorious for that, right? They had over 600 rules that they made up in their own head, arbitrary personal rules that were not scripture. And Christ himself commands us not to follow the commandments of man as the commandments of God, because if we do that, then we're worshiping him in vain. So we got to be careful that we don't make our personal opinions or convictions or preferences God's commandments, right? So that's another distinction. The Bible teaches us in Galatians that we're called to be free in Christ. Now, our culture would interpret that differently from how we would interpret it. As believers, we would interpret that as freedom from ourselves, freedom from sin, freedom from the letter of the law, but also freedom from lasciviousness. So those are the two extremes, right? Legalism and lasciviousness that can lead into abuse. Then the last one distinction I would make is the difference between unity and uniformity. So as a church, the true church is supposed to be united on the essentials of the Christian faith. The main essentials, I would say, are the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, or how we view salvation, right?
Yeah.
Then there's people that try to pick and choose certain doctrines that are non-essentials and make those essentials. So we need to be very careful that we're united on the essentials and that we don't become sort of like cookie cutter, like Chuck Swindoll says, in our approach to Christianity, where, you know, Dale prefers to use one version of the Bible, I prefer to use another. We don't discriminate against each other on that basis, right? Or we might have different views on prophecy or eschatology, and we don't discriminate. There's room for liberty. I forget who, you might know who it is, Dale, who said that on the essentials of the Christian faith, we should have unity. On the non-essentials, we should have liberty, and in all things, we should have Christian charity. That would be the mark of a true church, which no cult-like church or traditional cults follow.
Yeah. I think in the Presbyterian tradition, I know it's the doctrine of the liberty of conscience is what they call it. That's
okay.
In the Westminster Confession, for example.
Yeah.
But, just one quick follow-up here. It's not on the list of questions, but I'm sort of curious because I have a friend who's going towards the Eastern Orthodox Church. So you kind of mentioned the interdependency of the early church. Does that need to be some sort of like formal hierarchical process that has oversight in the church, or do you think there's a role for independence? But how do you see the interdependency kind of working in practice?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the way I would see it is when we look at the apostles, like Peter and Paul and the other apostles, they sort of had oversight over the churches. They were the ones who called for the election of elders in the first place, and then deacons. So, and they commanded others, their workers, to go out from city to city and elect elders. So it certainly appears from the New Testament, and we also know that the letters in the New Testament were circular letters, so all the churches read them, so they weren't just for one individual church, that there was accountability. And we have all kinds of verses that allude to that, where elders are supposed to be rebuked if they're sinning. We are supposed to judge issues within the church. So that gives us clear direction. There's examples, right? There's examples also of Paul rebuking Peter on legalistic issues of circumcision. And then 3 John, we have the example of the Apostle John. And I always get the guy's name wrong. It's Diotrephes, I guess. Diotrephes. There we go. I got it right. Diotrephes.
One of those.
Pastor. So this guy appears to be a pastor or elder or leader. And he's very divisive. He's not even accepting the disciples, right? And excommunicating people of the church. It also says there he's slandering people with malicious words. And Paul calls that evil. He says those that do evil don't know God. But on the other hand, he gives an example of another leader named Demetrius, that this person was well spoken of by the church. So he wasn't exclusive. He wasn't elitist. He wasn't maligning other believers for different reasons, or excommunicating people out of the church. So we're encouraged to have this sort of interdependence, accountability, one with another. Unfortunately, we don't see that in practice in the church today as much as we should. But to sort of close things out, I think that fellowships, Christian fellowships, would have an oversight today, would sort of play the same role that the apostles played in the first century. But again, not every church is under an official church fellowship, right? We've all heard stories of authoritarian pastors or leaders where they've been reported to their church fellowship, and the president will step in and remove them or rebuke them, right? So that's when things are working properly. But in many cases, if the church is independent, there is no church fellowship for accountability, and then almost certainly they will become cult-like in their practice. Not necessarily in their doctrine, but in some cases, the doctrines as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
So hang on. You've kind of answered my next two questions. Obviously, in contrast, how do Christians who maybe find themselves in a cult-like environment, kind of thing, they recognize some of the indicators that you've mentioned, and the lack of a true church and pastor, but at the same time, they're an independent Baptist church. They don't have mechanisms of appealing to some outside governing body or some outside source to kind of address that. What should the Christians in that kind of environment should they do? Do they just leave? What's their responsibility?
I would recommend that they come together, they document things, they maybe possibly start an investigation they report the church to affiliations that they may be connected with. And then there's also, if there's financial or charity law violations, that they report those things to the government. So those are some things they can do.
Okay, so I think that you guys kind of get the point. There's several interesting things there that he brought up that I want to address with you guys. So, okay, first in the first place, one thing I would like to bring up is this issue that the difference between unity of the church and uniformity of the church. So I totally agree with what Jamie was saying, and I think that's what Tony was saying as well. Is look, we have to be united on the essential doctrines, and I also think it's a goal. Look, we should be united, aiming to be united on everything, even secondary issues. But we have to recognize, because we live in a fallen world, that's just never going to happen until Jesus comes back. It's never going to be the case until Judgment Day that every Christian agrees on every single thing, including minor, secondary, or tertiary issues. So in recognition of that, I think we should aim for unity in that we discuss and respect each other's opinions and try to give reasons. But in unity, that's different than aiming for this goal of uniformity. And that's what I believe Pastor Steve at Midland Park is aiming for. He always had. I couldn't be a teacher, for example, because I wasn't a Calvinist, or I wasn't a young earth creationist, and that terrified him. Oh, you're going to bring division to the church. You're going to cause confusion and doubts. No, look, we can have we're united in the essential issues, but we can have liberty of conscience on the secondary issues and disagree and respectfully listen to each other's reasons for why we hold certain opinions. And, we wrestle with the scriptures together. We're united despite our differences of opinion as we work towards the goal of finding out the truth. So in that sense, we don't insist upon this uniformity. And that's the issue at Midland Park, is that, no, it's this top down, you've got to agree with everything Pastor Steve says, otherwise you're bringing division. And outside of him, this is something I find is a problem with Roman Catholics, Eastern Orthodox. They all need this infallible authority to top down tell them, whether you disagree or not, it doesn't matter. You just bend the knee and you believe like the infallible authority. So it's enforcing this uniformity, which is a farce, in my opinion, rather than the true goal of unity. Look, let's actually all truly believe and be united on the truth of these essential and hopefully in time secondary issues. But yeah, David Russell, I'll start with you. What's your take on this issue of unity versus enforced uniformity?
Well, we have evidence all throughout the early church and, all throughout church history to begin with. And I think the earliest one that comes to mind is the Quarter-Deciman controversy, right? Where you had one of John's disciples celebrating Easter on Saturday in lieu of the Passover. And then you had Rome celebrating it on Sunday. And these guys started writing letters back and forth. They finally decided to meet. And at the end of the day, there's no agreement. There's no agreement on when you should celebrate. So what did they do? They broke bread and they took communion together and said, Christianity does not need uniformity on these type of issues, but we do have unity. And they gave us kind of how it should look, how a disagreement should look within that context, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it also brings this other issue up that was in the video of the plurality of elders and stuff like that, and accountability, right?
Mm-hmm.
So where I would answer him a little different, we use there's apostle overseers, they kind of oversaw this, they kind of oversaw that, but then you hear Tony saying, no, the elders, and James was kind of like the deciding, force in that.
He also mentioned association. So I don't know if you want to throw that in.
I'll go into that in a little bit, because this might be a little lengthy response, but yeah, you even have amongst the early church, they did hold each other accountable. You had, and I think First Clement, and I could be wrong here on my letters here, but there's basically issue in Corinthians where they got rid of all their elders. They kicked them out of the church. The lady kicked all the elders out,
Yeah.
and Clement addresses. He's like, "What you did was wrong. You can't do that. You have to you have to follow this procedure, and you guys are wrong." So there is accountability there. There's always been. So when it comes to associations, I experienced this when I was in the cult-like church I was in, right? Where they always have this need to be under something because it's kind of ingrained in, I think, the psyche of the church is there is something over it. So where I wouldn't say that you need like apostles like over the church, there's this definite accountability there that comes from the person that made you a disciple in the first place, right? So you have this idea of your mentor is always supposed to be your mentor. You if you have questions, you go to your mentor. You go to the person that's educating you, and they can get it wrong. They're not infallible. We're not saying this is an infallible thing, but what we're saying is it provides accountability, right? Because they have to be accountable to somebody that they're under, right? So we're all like trying to be humble and learn from each other. It's that that the interdependency you were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
So I think we have an abundance of evidence that shows us what we can do and what we should do. And even, I think it's vital, and I think it has to happen, is if you start an independent church, especially here in the States where you have the ability to do that pretty easily, you should probably find associations that are lined up with you and get help, and get accountability because you need it. I think the plurality of elders is super important within a local body. So I would definitely promote that as well. I think you need that, and you have to have elections on it. Church history provides us examples of how those type of things happen. So learn a little bit from your history and maybe apply some of it. And, you want to have some of this behavior, even though like David said earlier, and I totally agree with him, that cult-like activity is not only amongst believers, but also unbelievers. And it's going to be there as long as we're alive. I think it's going to be there.
So just before I go to David J for his take on that issue, I just want to follow up with you, David Russell, because look, in terms of my investigation at Midland Park with Pastor Steve, they do have a plurality of elders, and I spoke with them, right? But
right,
because there's this enforced uniformity, we're not allowed to question what he's pastor.
Oh yeah,
if he speaks on a theological issue, it's not our place to question him. He's been to seminary, we haven't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's the problem.
So how does the plurality work in certain situations where, well, they just do whatever the pastor tells them?
Yeah, that's a problem, and that's a mindset, and I don't think there's a real answer for that unless people start getting out of that mindset and actually learn what the Bible teaches, when it comes to this and that. But I had a similar situation where this guy gave a prophecy over a friend of mine. I even told David Johnson this one time too, that he gave a prophecy over my cousin. And it was totally wrong. It was totally, completely wrong, right? And it really wrecked her, for weeks, And when I came to question it, I was told, no, when they're under the influence of the Holy Spirit, they can't be wrong. And then they start giving all these weird justifications about why they couldn't be wrong, and they could be seen into the future and a couple months ahead. And it's like, come on, dude, that's not what the Bible even is. It's not even close to what Scripture talks about when it talks about any of these type of things. So I just, for me, naivety and ignorance can really ruin a church. If you have a plurality of elders, they're there for a reason, and if they're just gonna uniformly fall under their pastor, then they're really not a plurality of equals at that point. So it totally defeats the purpose.
Gotcha. Well said. Yeah. Oh, David J, over to you on this issue of unity versus uniformity. Did you see a difference back in your Christian days, and how do you view it today as an atheist?
Yeah. Um, so Russell, I was listening to you. I just can't comment on all of that. It's like a William Lane Craig speech that a person has 5 minutes to respond to. I can't do it.
Well, I thank you for
75
comparing
points.
me. I,
So-
I thank you for comparing me to Craig there, but I'm not even close.
so,
But
Well, what,
um,
what he said in the video, what Jamie said in the video, then do you have
yeah,
a response to that?
yeah, I do. Uniformity versus uh, unity. This is a subject that my church uh, had issues with, and I think all churches have issues with. And I want to preface any remarks I say by saying there are no easy answers to this. When you throw kind of a theology on top of all of this, it's very murky and it's difficult. It's difficult when you're a Christian. It's difficult when you're not a Christian who's looking at it from the outside in. So just an example of some of the difficulties. And since we're talking about the Baptist Church, let me just speak about the Southern Baptist Church. This was not my denomination, but I know a bit about it. This is in the news. This is fairly recent news, so you might be aware of how the Southern Baptist Convention has disfellowshipped some of its congregations because of the subject of women pastors. That's a very important issue to Southern Baptists and to a lot of Christians. And yet there is nowhere in the Bible that says this is a definite issue on which all people must agree. You must be uniform on this. This is an essential to the Christian faith. It does not say that. No, there are some definite things that are said about it. I agree with that. And what the Southern Baptist would likely say is it doesn't matter whether this is an essential to the Christian faith or not. This is a clear biblical apostolic teaching, and you do not have the freedom to subvert apostolic teachings. And so if you have women pastors, it is not an issue of whether that's a salvific issue or not. The real issue is that you either respect the authority of the apostles or you don't. And if you don't, then you're an apostate church. So there is an example where you can write out all of the lists of essential topics that you want to. The role of women does not appear on them, and yet it is an issue that many Christians believe it is right to divide over, and that uniformity is necessary. And so I find it not as useful to talk about that topic in simplistic terms. It's not simple. If the apostles wanted to make it simple, they could have simply said, in Second Jude somewhere, which doesn't exist, by the way, or Jude the second chapter, something like that. It could have said, and these are the essential doctrines upon which everyone must agree. But it doesn't. And even in the example that was brought up earlier, Acts 15, this council over circumcising Gentiles and that sort of thing. There was at the end of that, it was okay. Just two things: you have to abstain from, drinking blood, and what was the other thing? It was like two things. What
Eating
if
strangled meat,
eating something like that?
and
Yeah,
sexual immorality.
sexual. Yeah, okay. So what if the church there said, okay, thanks for your advice, but we're not gonna take that. Well, those weren't essentials to the Christian faith, and yet you had a kind of an agreement, but not every congregation there may have agreed, and yet you get the feeling that they had to have uniformity over these issues. So it is never as simple as we kind of like to make it out. It's always a difficult negotiation of people trying to do the best they can to honor the commands of God in the best way they know how. And it's there's nothing in the Bible that makes that any simpler than it is now.
So that's an interesting point. I'll just come back with this final thing on this issue. I agree with you. Look, there are disagreements about even essentials and that sort of thing among certain churches, right? Like Eastern Orthodox, for example, or Roman Catholics believe that water baptism is an essential. Me and David would disagree with that as Protestants.
My cult would have said that. That's one of the things that we would have said.
Church of Christ says that
Yeah.
too. Yeah,
that's what I mean by my cult. I think of the mainline churches of Christ as a cult.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. So I think that's true. Yes, it isn't as simple as we say, but I do think that it's a lot less complicated than you make it sound to be. I do think that on the essentials, we have a perfectly adequate mechanism for solving it. And for the most part, I would say most Christians throughout history are able to recognize the main essentials, despite some disagreement amongst some denominations and that sort of thing. I think we all agree on the deity, death, and resurrection of Jesus. That's key. And even in my own case, applying it to my case here for a practical example with Midland Park, they even provided their own list of 7 essentials that I largely agreed with. There was only one little thing where potentially what they meant by sovereignty of God might have implied Calvinism. But again, given the words, I totally agreed with their thing. So I don't think when it comes to churches versus cults, I personally don't think that they're looking for unity. I think that they were looking for uniformity. I want to control what everyone is saying and believing and doing. I want them to believe exactly like what I do. Whether they really believe it or not doesn't matter. They need to say the words, the right words. And perhaps a practical indicator that would help you adjudicate, look, is my pastor or elder or priest or whatever, does he care about true unity, or does he just want uniformity? Because in my case, look, again, I was prevented because I'm not a Calvinist. I don't subscribe to the 1689 London Baptist Confession. It's really important to me to be a teacher. That would make me feel really good, and to some extent, I would be proud of that because I think that's an important office and it's important to me. I wasn't allowed to be a teacher, and I had to just accept that because I didn't subscribe, and I might cause division by teaching something.
Well, that's because you're Satan.
Because
but if the elders of that church came to that
hang on,
conclusion,
David, because
okay.
I just want to make a point, and I'll let
Sure.
you come back. But this is what I mean. There's this hypocritical double standard for an entire year, including at the time I was being told by Pastor Steve at Midland Park, that I can't be a teacher because I'm not a Calvinist, I'm not a young earth creationist, and that. He had Louis Dizon. Everyone here knows Louis Dizon. He's a Roman Catholic. And Pastor Steve knew for an entire year that this guy was believing in the Roman Catholic Church, but yet he was an adult Bible study teacher for an entire year, despite him not believing in anything. So that's kind of that hypocrisy, that double standard kind of betrays, look, you just want uniformity because Louis, you don't care what he actually believes. You just care, yeah, but he was teaching the standard Calvinist, the Reformed Baptist lines that you wanted him to say. That's all. So that's an indicator, I think, that it was about control and uniformity. It wasn't about, hey, I actually want you guys to really believe because I've got the truth. I want you to know the truth. But yeah, David Johnson.
I wasn't disagreeing with you on the. Look, you've told me your story many times. We've talked about this over the years. I encouraged you to leave for some of these reasons a long time ago. So you're not getting any pushback from me there on the main thesis. What I'm trying to suggest though is that when you add theology to this mix, it does get a little bit murky. And so one of the things that we talked about is, or that has been talked about on this show, is the plurality of elders, and you can't just fire the elders kind of thing. Okay, let's just take that as read. Actually, well, that's another topic. I'm not even going to go in there. Let's just take that as read. Okay, so you have elders. This preacher is, working. He's part of the pastorate, I guess we could say. They have made this decision. The elders clearly didn't disagree with the preacher on this. And so whether they were right or wrong, they came to the agreement that you should not be a teacher. Were they wrong? Sounds like they were wrong. I certainly think they were wrong. You're a good teacher. But do they not have the right to make a decision that you think is wrong? If they do, then I don't see what the recourse would be, because it is their right to make those decisions. And if it's not their right to make those decisions, I don't know what the point of an eldership is anyway.
All right. Okay. Fair enough. Okay. So the other thing is, I don't know if I got you guys. The other point here is, again, about the local versus universal church. And on that front, my own take is exactly the same as Tony's. Both are biblical. Both are in the Bible. There are clear references to the universal church. Romans 16:4 talks. 1 Corinthians 16:1 talks about the organization of, that's for the local church, right? So there's this universal church, right? The past, present, and future invisible universal church of all Christians, people who are saved. And you join that automatically at salvation. So it talks about that in 1 Corinthians 12:13. Romans chapter 8, verse 9, I think, is a reference to the universal church. This was instituted at the cross with Jesus. That's Ephesians chapter 2, verse 16. I think that that's clearly biblical. And it's also, the church is described as being spiritual in Galatians 3:28. But it's also equally true that it does speak about this need for a physical ecclesia, a local assembly that's manifesting the church in a given geographical area. It's just, simple logistics. You can't, you need to attend a local body and people that can be responsible as a pastor or an elder for a certain group of people in a certain locality. And that's where you get certain verses like Romans 16:4, talking about it being a physical organization. There can be standards for joining that for discipleship purposes. That's, I think, in Ephesians 4, verses 11 to 12, or 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 2 to 5. So that's the thing. I think we have to admit that the Bible speaks of both a local church and a universal church. But the problem for me is when there's this stress on, okay, well, we exclude the universal church as having any real application, and it's all about the local. So we don't, it's in effect an isolationist policy. You don't care about external members, right? And that's the problem that I had with Midland Park. Like, look, if we've got a complaint as a fellow member of Christ, surely you believe, at least Midland Park does, David, at the Church of Christ, I think you guys deny this, that there are other true Christians who are saved outside of your local assembly or local body.
Yeah, that's the main thing that makes it a cult, as far as I'm concerned, the exclusivity.
Gotcha. So that's even more problematic. I will say Midland Park isn't that bad. They do teach. Obviously, there are saved Christians outside of their four walls, and
right. But we believe there are saved Christians outside of our four walls, just not outside of our denomination. And we wouldn't have even said that not everyone in the denomination was saved. But so there was a sense of the universal church in that wherever you were the Church of Christ, then the true church is. But we didn't believe in a universal church in that everyone who called themselves Christians could somehow be a part of the universal church if you were not, in fact, identifying with the denomination, but in air quotes, that Jesus built. You're in some other church / cult.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, so good to know then. Very well. So here's the issue that I'm trying to settle on about this local versus universal church, because this was used to invalidate any and all complaints against the pastor. Say, oh, you guys are external members. We don't care. We don't know. We don't have to pay attention to you guys. And I think that is totally unbiblical, right? So from their perspective at Midland Park, I have to admit there is a perspective, right, that we don't want to be, as external members, interfering unreasonably in the affairs of another local church that we're not a part of, right? So, it would be absolutely insane for me to show up. I don't like your lights. You need to change your light. Who are you? Like, what business is it of you to be interfering in the local governance of the church? But there's also, on the other hand, there are reasonable times when external Christians who are concerned about fellow members of the body of Christ do need to get involved. And I think this was such a time. So if internal members are having issues and they're afraid to stand up to the pastor because he's a bit of a bully and that sort of thing, they want external consultants to help them and investigate things and to help them in their process. That's totally reasonable. And look, the example I would give here is, look, imagine David Russell. You don't attend my local church at all, but imagine you went out to, I don't know why you would, but let's say you went to a strip club one day and you saw my pastor doing a striptease dance on the thing, right? I would want you to tell me. I would want to be informed that my pastor is sinning in this way, so I can, because I don't want to have a pastor who doesn't fulfill the biblical requirements for a pastor that I asked Tony about.
Yeah. But Dale, why would I be there in the first place?
That's what I said. let's just say you went to
why would you be at a gay strip club? On top of that, I mean,
come on, Dale.
You know what I mean? So there are certain pastoral disqualifications. I had Tony read the qualifications, right? So if somebody as an external member observes a pastor unrepentingly engaging in behaviors that disqualify them as a pastor, I, as an internal member, would like to know. Yes, as an external member, please inform me. You're not interfering, you're informing me. And that's what the biblical model of interdependence that we see all the time, right? I would want to make an informed decision. You don't just go, oh, well, not my problem. I don't go to that church. The heck with the Christians there. Let them be under a false teacher or a false pastor. I don't care. Not my business. That's the wrong attitude, right? There are times where it's appropriate to take the concerns or information from an external member. That's the main point. But yeah,
can I get some clarification before you turn that over to Russell?
Sure.
I have things to say about it, but I just want a clarification right now. Are you saying that, let's say it's another Christian at another local church and they see this, are you saying that that Christian in that local church could not, in their own rights, bring up disciplinary action to another Christian simply because they're in a different congregation?
So
why would they need to go to your congregation, in other words, to do disciplinary action?
Oh, well, I think in terms of disciplinary action, that's specific in the biblical sense of withholding the Lord's Supper, right? And that's what excommunication is about. So obviously, I, as just a random member of another church, I have no ability to withhold the Lord's Supper from them. Like if I might inform their pastor about it and let them decide.
But this is a person who is clearly engaging in public sin. We could even say sexual sin if we wanted to. I don't really see a need to make those distinctions, but this is a Christian. You have another Christian. They are in a different congregation, but let's say the same denomination, same belief structures and that sort of thing. And that preacher of yours has fellowship and association with other preachers and other churches. And it seems like other churches could say, yeah, we are, we're coming to you with this, and go through the steps and say, we exclude you from the fellowship. And it would also seem like your church would have to uphold that somehow. And so if you're saying that autonomy is such that the outside member couldn't do anything but tell one of your members about it, then you're suggesting a very tight level of autonomy that I
Well,
don't know that can be sustained.
So I will say no. This is one instance. Okay, so David Russell took off. He'll be back soon. But so this is one issue where I disagreed with what Tony Costa said. I
Okay.
don't. I do think. In fact, I have. For example, against Jay Dyer, he claimed to be a Christian. He's clearly unrepentant about clearly sinful behaviors. So in a sense, even though it's not technically excommunication, because I have no authority to take away the Lord's Supper from him or do attend his church or anything like that, I would not fellowship with him. That's what I could have control over. I will refuse to be a part of any show with that guy until he repents. And the aim is I want him to repent. I would be glad to do a show with him on any topic, but he needs to recognize the sins that he did and repent.
Okay, but shouldn't he be withdrawn from officially from all churches and have the communion withheld from him? Once again, I don't necessarily follow the whole withholding communion, but just using your language and your formulation, we don't have to geek out about that now. Wouldn't it still apply that you could go through those processes and say this person is disfellowshipped from the church, universal? This person is disfellowshipped, and anyone who does not acknowledge that would be siding with a person who has been deemed a heathen by the church. Once again, if you're saying the only church that can do that is the local congregation, then in fact it is perfectly right or acceptable for that person who's disfellowshipped by your congregation to go next door to the next congregation, because your disfellowshipping doesn't cross your walls into theirs. And if it does, then they should be able to disfellowship from their walls to yours.
So I don't see what okay, so I totally agree.
In your example,
I think that Jay Dyer's church ought to, in his case, if they do their investigation, they determine that I'm correct, that he is an unrepentant sinner and he's continuing in sin, they should disfellowship. They should not serve him the Lord's Supper. I have no authority to order his church to do it. I just, as
but your church could do
member
it, right?
of Christ, I can inform. Huh?
Couldn't your church do it?
Of
You're
course,
still a part of the church, right?
Yeah, if he was a visitor to our church, we could deny him the Lord's Supper, right? If my accusation is deemed true and the pastor goes, "Yep, I think you're right. He is an unrepentant sinner," then absolutely they can withhold and that's what I would expect them to do, right? So that's the one thing.
I still don't think we're communicating that well, but I won't press the issue further. We'll talk after this, and I'll see if I can make it a little bit clearer. But
okay, I thought I answered it, but no.
You answered it in a way that made me think that you still didn't get what I was suggesting.
Okay.
I mean, I can try give another 30-second attempt. If Russell is here, maybe he can translate me.
Yeah, he's back. Okay. Well, here's
I'm back.
Okay. Last thing I say before I go to you, David Russell, on this issue, but so I potentially differ with Tony Costa to some extent in that, yes, I do think if it's clear that someone who's claiming to be a Christian is not a Christian, like they're denying Jesus' deity on a doctrinal level, or their behavior, they're engaging in certain moral sins. Now, it doesn't have to just be sexual immorality. Even Tony Costa said, well, if it's just a lie or something, that doesn't matter. I think that does, right? But it's not about the sin itself. That's not why we're disciplining it, because we sin all the time. It's about that unrepentant versus repentant attitude. How are we responding when we are confronted with our sin? Are we acknowledging that, or are we responding reasonably to figure out, am I sinning or not?
Right. But that's why essential issues, the whole thing of essential versus non-essential issues is a red herring as far as I'm concerned, because it's not a matter of whether it's an essential issue or non-essential issue. It's a matter of whether you are sinning in an unrepentant way.
But
And
that's an
so,
essential issue, right? So morality. Remember, there's
okay, but
doctrine.
fine. But everything just becomes an essential issue. That, like I was saying about the women preachers, not actually an essential issue, except when you put it in terms of. But the Bible makes clear statements about it, and so if you have women preachers, it's a sin, and you are unrepentant about the sin. It doesn't matter if it's actually a sin or not. So don't get me wrong. People who think it is, that's how the reasoning goes. And so, uh, it doesn't have to be, oh, they're denying the deity of Christ. What they're doing is denying a direct command of Scripture. Same thing as far as they're concerned. And the problem is not that you are wrong about an issue, it's that you have an unrepentant attitude toward a sin when it's pointed out to you.
Right. So yeah, so you would need to make that argument, and we would need to adjudicate who's right on that front. If denying biblical inerrancy or something, or categorizing certain things as secondary is proper or not, I think it is, and I can make that argument. So if you confronted me with saying, "Hey, this person believes that women can't be pastors or something like that," and I say, "Well, that's wrong. That's wrong, biblically speaking, in my opinion. In fact, David Russell believes that way, right?" That's not a thing that's an essential issue. It's a secondary issue, in my opinion, because it's not explicitly or even implicitly suggested that will make or break your state of salvation. But yeah, so that's how I would respond to that.
Yeah,
But
no, I agree that it's not an essential issue in the way that you're just defining essential issues. What I'm saying is it doesn't matter in the case of disfellowship. If you have a church, if your denomination believes that women pastors are a sin, and you have member churches saying, yeah, well, we're going to put women pastors up anyway, disfellowship is called for. Because what they're essentially doing is saying we deny the apostolic teaching and we don't care.
okay, gotcha. So okay, I'll turn it to David Russell then, because he's been trying to get in here. But
No, I'm right here. I'm just listening. I mean, y'all are making some valid points. I think I agree with David on some of it, and I agree with you on some of it. So I mean, I think you guys are kind of like button up. I think David explained it clearly earlier when he says when theology gets involved, a lot of systems, they do get murky, and I think we have an abundance of evidence that things do get murky. I think there are things that maybe I think there are essentials that all Christians agree on, and there are 5 at least that all Christians agree on. And you'll be surprised at the list I got when I asked the question, or when I researched the question. And it's not what we think it is in a lot of ways. But yeah, I think it, when theology does get involved, it does get murky, and you have to wade through it. I mean, you have to discuss it and take a stance on certain issues. And I do believe in the independence of local congregations to an extent. But this is all comes to a mindset at the end of the day too. And this is where I think this is what the whole topic is about. People having the right mindset when it comes to actually running a church that is beneficial, and I would say a true church. David might disagree with that phrase, but
I don't have a problem with it.
yeah. But like,
so David,
I think there's that medium where you say, yeah, it's a humble attitude. You got to have a humble attitude, and a lot of people don't.
So just to clarify your answer on this, and then we'll move on to the next thing. Like, what's your difference? Because our investigation committee was labeled, kind of said, look, you're interfering in things that aren't your business, versus with the interdependency of the church, there are times where it's appropriate to speak up or get involved in one way or another. So what's in your notion, David Russell, where's the line between, as an external member of a local congregation, we're just being a busybody and interfering in affairs that shouldn't concern us, versus no, we need to speak up? Like, where's that line?
Well, there's I think it was drawn in the fact that you had people asking for your guys' help, and they went outside of just the local congregation to seek that help. Unfortunately, those that are in charge, they might not agree, and they might just toss the whole thing under the rug, which I think is detrimental. I don't think it's good. I think it's, like you said, it's unrepentant. It shows an unrepentant heart. It lacks humility. We've got to be on the same page. We got to be unified on that front, not uniformly, but we have to be unified on that front. But it seems that when somebody asks you for your involvement and they go through the right channels in their church constitution to involve an investigation committee, I don't see a problem with that. Especially, I think things should get involved when there's clear laws that are being violated when it comes to abuse and scandal and stuff like that, that maybe even have legal ramifications. So there's a lot to it, and it's like I agree with Dr. Costa when he said that it's a case-by-case basis and all those things have to be considered. So I guess that's where I would stand on it.
Would it be okay, Dale, if we drill down on autonomy a little bit more? Because I think there's some meat there that might speak to some of the questions that you're asking. Autonomy, how much autonomy does a local church have versus how much accountability do they have for other churches where outsiders might have some authority? This is a fairly direct to the point kind of topic, and
Yeah.
I'd love to maybe delve into that a little bit more if you think it's appropriate.
Sure. We maybe about 10 minutes, between 10 and 15 minutes, because I do have about 3 other things that I want to fit in. But yeah, it's if you guys are good with time.
I'm good right now. Yeah.
Sure.
You're
All
good?
right. So I'll just, rather than making a series of statements, I'll just ask a series of questions to help maybe clarify some of my thought and understand where you guys are on this. So I came from a church that was very autonomous, congregational. The congregation is the highest level of the church, and yet we still recognized a fellowship of the brotherhood worldwide, but we didn't per se recognize that one group of elders had any authority over any other group of elders. And yet, when some preacher starts teaching something that we considered false doctrine, a group of elders or people in churches could say that's false teaching and proceed to disfellowship from a church that is clearly teaching false teaching, kind of like the Baptist convention in our church. Well, let's just say women pastors, because there are some versions of the Church of Christ that allow for women pastors. We would, quote unquote, disfellowship those churches. But what does it mean for one church to disfellowship another church? They have no say in that church. If the congregation is truly the highest level of autonomy, your disfellowshipping a church is just rhetorical. It means nothing in the grand scheme of things, and yet I believe that it is necessary for a mechanism to be there for such a thing to exist. I mean, we look at the Bible, we look at Paul. What church did Paul attend? Well, you could say he was an apostle to all churches. Or at least especially to the ones that he planted. But we don't have apostles today. So Paul could go into Corinth and say, I'm laying down the law. We don't have anyone like that today who can go into some other church and say, I'm laying down the law. And so I guess I am trying to drill down into what you think the highest level of autonomy is. If it is the congregation, then it is logically reasonable to say, okay, well, someone from another church, you think we're doing something wrong? We've got a body of elders. We say we're okay, so butt out. But if that's the case, then there's no way for there to be any accountability in the grand scheme of things with one church toward another. So how do you work that out, Russell? In particular, I haven't heard your thoughts on this, but I mean, it just seems very confused to me, and this was one of the problems that I had within my own church. Of, I could quickly see the problems with this extreme idea of autonomy.
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes down to a mindset, David. I think I mean, you hit the nail on the head. I do think that, and this is evident all throughout church history, where we have heretics and the large body of believers reject them, right? So I see it's a very big issue, and what I would say is it comes down to that humility. And I tried to explain this earlier. Maybe I didn't do it right, but I think there is that humility within a true church where they have the plurality of elders, and they're submitted one to another, and they're also submitted to those that mentored them. So there is a level of submission that I think is there that's within reason, and we can discuss all that. I mean, that could be a plethora of topics. You know what I mean? But but no, I mean, I hear your concern, and I think that if it's complete autonomy, yeah, there is that idea where they can just go off the beaten path, but then that's where you get cults. It ends up happening, and I don't think anybody's immune to it, whether you're Eastern Orthodox, Catholic, I mean, or
Independent
even
churches
Protestant.
are specifically, they're particularly susceptible
Very,
to
very much,
cults
absolutely.
having this, because they are very extreme autonomy. The
Yeah,
with
and I
independent
experienced
churches,
it.
yeah,
I experienced it. They started getting involved with the Word of Faith people. That's who they were trying to get under. And next thing you know, you've got a preacher telling us to pray to God to show us the money now. It's like that's the total antithesis of what we should be saying. We should be saying, okay, show us the hurt, the dying, the poor, and let's give them help, and let's do what we have to do. Not show me money. I mean, it's just it goes. It is problematic, and no, I would not deny it. I hope that answers your question.
I'm good.
Okay. All right. Awesome. So that was quicker than I thought. So, okay. All right. So the next major thing that I want to get your guys' opinion on is Matthew 18, because this was appealed to, again, used against the investigation committee at Midland Park over and over again. And to some extent, look, it is true. This is, as a Christian, this is in the Bible. And I think I agree with the Bible's procedures and stuff like that. So it was claimed, look, certain people didn't follow the Matthew 18 process. So in the first place, I want to turn it to you guys. I'll start with David Russell first on this one. Do you guys think there are ever exceptions? Like if you're following Matthew 18, but because it's against the pastor, he has all the power. So, okay, the two witnesses, they'll just agree with him. And you're either prevented from bringing it before the church, as I was. In my case, I tried to follow Matthew 18, but because I wasn't considered a local member, I wasn't allowed to take my complaints before the church. Or in cases of where the eldership or the pastor is abusive, and it's just a farcical process, like you're not going to get a fair hearing. Okay, forget everything I said. Let me just ask you generally: are there exceptions?
All right, Satan, come on.
Are there exceptions to Matthew 18? Are there ever times where you need to go outside that process?
Do you think you might want to read that for the listeners? I mean, the three of us are theology wonks. We know it pretty well, but I think if you're going to ask a question like, are there exceptions, maybe help people understand what the rule is.
That is a good point. Okay. 18 for him. What verse is it again? Here it is, 15. So Matthew chapter 18, verse 15. If your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault to his face, between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you've gained your brother. But if he does not listen, take one or two others along with you, that every charge may be established by the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even unto the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector, meaning you discipline this person. That's what the verse itself actually says in Matthew 18, verses 15 to 17. Mr. Russell, what's your? Are there exceptions to this? Like I can see claims where it can't be followed or wouldn't be followed properly.
I mean, this comes down to whether you're going to uphold what you believe as far as scripture, or you're going to not do it. It comes down to, what are you submitted to? Are you submitted to the scripture? Are you submitted to Jesus Christ? Or are you doing your own thing? And, as a church member, I think the Bible speaks plainly against doing your own thing. We have mechanisms in place for these type of egregious sins or whatever that's done against people. And before an elder is an elder, he's also a Christian, and he should be willing to hear people out. But if not, then you're dealing with somebody that's not in a position that he should be in. That's just my opinion on that. So he should be willing to go through the processes. But I also understand there are mechanisms in place that protect the congregation, and they have to go through they should follow this model as like a template. And yeah, I mean, if they don't, then shame on them. I mean, they're not following the scripture. And if that's the basis of your belief is you believe in the scriptures, you should be following them.
Gotcha.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Yeah. Okay, David J. I'll get your take on this Matthew 18 thing first, and then I'll give my sort of take.
Okay. So one of the reasons I wanted it read is because my denomination, we use this passage all the time. We actually seldom did it, so I don't know why we used it so much. But I actually think it's misapplied to the church. I don't think it's a good fit at all. I think that going to 1st and 2nd Corinthians, that's a better application, because when Jesus is talking here, there is no church. Church doesn't exist, not in any form whatsoever. And so having this ecclesia translated to church is one of those areas where I'm just going to speak above my pay grade and say it's an unfortunate translation. And I think it is an example of how moderns look at an old text and read into it, because assembly and church, not exactly the same thing as we think about it. But once again, whatever you think about church, ecclesia, it can't be the church that we have today because it didn't exist. So bear that in mind. He's also not speaking into Jewish synagogue polity. Jesus wasn't a teacher in the synagogue. So that's not what he's referring to either. So, just put that little earworm in there. But if we were going to try to create a model for this, then let's look at how it starts. If your brother offend you, not if your brother have a belief that you disagree with. So we would start there. So what do we mean by brother offend you? There's a whole truckload of things we can drive through that term. So whatever we are accepting is fitting for, if your brother offend you, then you go to that person. There are plenty of exceptions to that. Maybe someone has offended you and then they've left town. They came in, they visited, they offended you, and they went back home. You have no real option, to travel halfway across the world to, go tell them or whatever. Maybe you don't know them personally, but they said something, when they were teaching that you found offensive or whatever. It's very, very difficult to structure something like this. But again, we're talking about people within a community, someone does something that offends against you. Maybe they borrowed your rake and never returned it, or something like that. And they thought that you were giving it to them, and you were like, "No, I was expecting you to give it back." Okay, we've got that. And so you take it to them and you say, "Look, I really want my rake back." No, I'm not going to give it to you because it's mine. Possession is 9/10 of the law, and so you take it to two or three people within your community, and you say, "Hey, can you help me with this?" And you find some people who agree with you, and they do it, and he says, "Nah, I'm right, and you guys are wrong." And so you take it to the church, whatever that means in this context, because again, this is very difficult. But let's say you take it to the community as a whole, whatever that is. And he still won't hear the community. So what do? You throw him out of the community? He's got to move. He can't borrow any rakes anymore. You can't talk to him. You can't. It's very difficult. I mean, it's easy to kind of say this and read this verse in a vacuum, but when you just look at the details of it and try to construct a policy of church discipline for an organization that didn't exist with this passage, I think you run into all kinds of problems, which is the main reason most churches don't do this, because it is very, very difficult to apply, especially to the type of church we have today. By the way, 1 Corinthians is also not the type of church setting that we have today either. So we have to amend all of this stuff and kind of translate it over time and culture and so forth until it gets to us and our church. Now, what kind of rule are we going to make about disfellowshipping someone based on a bad teaching or a bad belief, or they stole my rake or what have you? To simply point to the Bible and says, this verse says this, and therefore, I think, takes you down a path that is unsustainable.
All right, awesome. Okay, so I'm going to give my take on that. Unlike Dave, I take David Russell's opinion. I do think this does apply to the church, although in this verse, I think it's talking about the universal church as manifested in local church and implemented in local churches. But
you would agree that there were no churches at the time Jesus said this, right?
I think there was, with the establishment of the disciples, that could be said to be the first church, right? So I mean that was a local assembly of believers and followers of Christ. So I think you can make that argument. Anyways, but that's a theological thing. Regardless, if the Matthew 18 thing does apply to the church, right? Let's say it does, for the sake of argument. I don't see it as this absolute rule. So number one, I do agree with it. This is a good policy. This is what we should be doing by default. I mean, if you've got a problem, this is how I lived. Whenever I had a problem with this pastor, I always would take it directly to him. Nothing would ever be done about it, but I would bring it to his face or whoever the person is. I would talk to them if I'm able to. I would go to them and explain the issue and that sort of thing. And I followed the next step in terms of having the two witnesses or two people with you and that sort of thing. And I was prevented from following the next thing of bringing it to the church, which in an independent Baptist setting would be a membership vote, right? You take your case before the members, they hear both sides of it, and then, as guided by the Holy Spirit, they decide. They take a vote on who's right or not and what should be done about it. So that's how I would interpret that. But there are exceptions. That in my case, I was accepted because the pastor, nope, you're not allowed. You're not an official member because I don't deem you fit to meet my requirements for being an internal member. So you can't bring it to the church. This Matthew 18 doesn't apply to you because it only applies to members of a local church. It's not a rule for Christians as a whole. There are also cases of abuse where people, and we found this in the investigation, people are afraid to stand up to this pastor here. They don't want to confront him because he's very volatile, very temperamental, and yells. Mostly, we only had one case of physical abuse against a board member where he grabbed and very harshly grabbed onto someone, an elderly board member's hand, and said, "I'm in charge here. You don't contradict me." But apart from that, no other cases of physical abuse that we were able to find. I have to admit that. But he is spiritually and verbally abusive, and people are afraid to confront him because nothing you say will get in. He's right, you're wrong, and he will yell at you and that sort of thing. And people just don't want to deal with it. It's easier for them out of the heck with it. I'm just not even going to bother. So in that case, if you're afraid of not being heard and it causing problems or something like that, that's an excuse not to confront that person directly. You have to circumvent the system.
That's why the passage is unsustainable. You can't say at once, I agree with this passage and this is what you should do, and at the other, except if you feel like it's a bad idea. So I just land on the side. I just get there earlier than you do. It's a bad idea.
I don't think it's necessarily a bad idea, David. I think it's more of those that are going to choose to follow it versus those that aren't. And there's biblical passages that talk about people that don't receive it, or who don't receive certain things. And at some point, you just wash your hands of it, kick the dust from your shoes.
Here's
unfortunately, but that's just me.
Yeah, and I also, we'll get there, but I don't want to leave you with a sense of defeatism. I think that applying this Matthew 18 passage is kind of the wrong model for what's going on here in your real life, Dale. But I actually do think that there are good things that you can do, which I think is probably over the arching topic of the discussion, which is to recognize, first of all, what bad and toxic churches and leaderships are, and then we can talk about what to do once you've recognized that. But I don't want to sidetrack it. I just want to let you know this is not a dead end for me, simply because I think this Matthew 18 doesn't apply. I think that there are other things that apply better.
Fair enough. Yeah, and that's what I'm saying. Like, I agree with David Russell. I think it does apply as our default, and it works a lot of times. But there are these exception cases, and the third and last one that we discovered as a committee that would come up is the fact that the Matthew 18 process is of a farcical nature, not in itself, but because the complaint is against the pastor, is against the person with the power who's able to and they're all colluding, like the deacons and elders are all in on it. And even the members of the church, it's a harsh word, but I think they've been brainwashed they only hear one perspective. If this pastor says Dale is of the devil and he's intimidating and bullying witnesses to get signatures, which was one of the claims he made against me and another on the committee. But I'm just revealing my own information because for privacy reasons. That's a total lie. That is total B. I never stepped foot in this witness's house. This was a board member who came to us and willingly wanted to help us because he didn't like the way Pastor Steve was running things in terms of the financial mismanagement and that sort of thing, right? But they only hear this one side over and over again, and that's all they hear. So they're brainwashed. It's not a fair process. And I myself experienced some of this stuff when I reached out to members of this church to hear their side, including the pastor, and that because I think if we're doing an investigation, we have to be fair and listen to the other side. Maybe there are explanations for some of the allegations, or maybe there's additional details that the witness didn't tell us about and stuff. So I made the effort as a favor to them to be fair as an investigator, to reach out to them and hear their side. And I remember I just mentioned I was an investigator to one of these members, and they started yelling at me, "You're trying to destroy the church. Shame on you." And the harassment. This is a supposed Christian, but they're just automatically defending before I even say anything or listening to my side or trying to consider what if Steve's wrong? What if this pastor is wrong and you're wrong? So yeah.
Big whoop, Dale. So you ran into some Christians that aren't acting Christian. Good gracious.
Yeah. So I think that this
But
this
I
is
mean,
a
it is a
time
big
when
work,
Matthew
though.
18 wouldn't work, right? If we brought it to the church, they're going to vote in favor of Steve because I'm the devil.
I
to
know.
them.
I know.
That's why it's inapplicable.
Well, no. Wait, well, Dale is the devil. Let's just get that correct.
Well,
His
I do
flag
drink-
has red in
I
it.
drink
His
red
cream
cream
soda's
soda.
red. He drinks milk out of a bag. I mean,
well,
come on, dude.
that alone, honestly. But bag milk
You're
people.
not
look it
helping
up.
here, Russell. I'm trying to do this as an edifying video for these.
Well, we got to have some laughs.
Yeah, that's true.
And why shouldn't they be at your expense, Dale? Because the alternative is so much worse. They could be mine. So here's the thing, Dale. I am with you on all of the details of this, but it's all of that, which is why I say when you try to make a model just based on Matthew 18, which for something that it wasn't even talking about, there may be some general principles in there that are good. For instance, one general principle that's good is if someone in your community does something offensive to you, you should talk to them. You should go to them. You shouldn't go around their back. You shouldn't gossip about it. You should go to them and see if you could deal with it and be done with it. And if you can't, and if you do have a community that you're, a very well-defined in-group, and you can get 2 or 3 to agree with you and go to them, then do that. But what if you can't get 2 or 3 to agree with you? Then that may be a case where it ends there, or it may be a case where you need a new community because you're just not going to make it in that community. So I just think that there are limits to what you can do with Matthew 18. And I think that your situation requires something more than that. Matthew 18 is just some simple, common sense things to people in small communities about how to get along. And this is so much more than that.
I agree. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I think we all agree with that. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. All right. Awesome. So I'll transition then. This other thing I asked Tony Costa about, and I thought he gave a great answer there, because this issue of submitting to the pastors, that this is biblical. It's in Hebrews 13. It does say we are to submit and to obey our pastors and elders. But David Russell, turning to you, you heard Tony's answer at the beginning of the show. Look, I've heard members, they're not allowed to even question Steve. They even at one point, a deacon and the church secretary told me they don't care about the truth. They're just going to side with whatever version of events. And I was offering, I'm like, I have evidence. I can show you text messages and emails from this person proving that what they said about me or the investigation committee is a lie. I can prove it to you. And they said, we don't care about the evidence. We're just going to take their side. It was kind of this tribalism, right? Us versus them. You're just an interferer. We don't want to hear from you. And it's not our job to question the pastor, at least on certain theological issues. He's got the training. We follow him. So what is a true biblical submission to our pastors or elders? What does that look like?
I want to put it simply, but it's going to come with a bunch of caveats. I mean, as like whenever I have a mentor, and I still have mentors to this day, I've submitted to them. I'll obey them.
And
especially in several.
David, sorry to interrupt. Because this is important. One of the things from one of the members here, they said that it wasn't their right to question because Steve's been to seminary. Now you are an authority. You're taking seminary. What's your academic background as well? Just for them.
Well, for my academic background, I have a BA in theology, and my MA is going to be in philosophy and apologetics.
So you're going to a seminary yourself?
I am, absolutely. But again, if there's a mindset here, and this has to do with what we're saying here with the cults. And when I look at a biblical model of submitting to my pastor, that comes with a lot of trust. Not only does it come with trust, but it also comes with the ability to recognize the truth. Like if he's speaking untruthful, that's where my submission ends. If he's doing things that are outside of what the scriptures teach, then I am not to submit to what he's doing on that on the outside, and I would even cut probably my mentorship with him. So I mean, there's a lot to it. So simply, Christ was full of grace and truth. Jesus valued truth. He even said, "I am the truth, the way, and the life." The truth. Learn the truth. The truth will set you free. So, if there's things, if people don't care about the truth, that's the basic point to where an appeal to authority is exactly what it is, a fallacy. And if you're just relying off of that, then I think you got bigger problems. And it comes in, like I said, it comes down to a mindset. It comes down to what are where do you regard the truth? I mean, the truth is important. So yeah, I really don't know what else to say, but to say that, that only goes so far. Submitting only goes so far as to you start disregarding the truth. I mean, that's when I'm going to cut ties. And I think David said something real important. There's common sense stuff that we should just be able to look at and be like, yeah. And then there's stuff where we have to investigate and stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, truth is always the most important thing, at least from my perspective.
Awesome.
I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, thank you. And thank you for clarifying. I should have gotten your guys' academic backgrounds when we just began, because that's something that I'm hoping the members of this church, I'm going to send them the link. I'm hoping this will be edifying. I'm not intending this to just be some bash fest. I'm trying to get it on the main key issues of contention and stuff. And I'm hoping it'll speak to some of them. So,
yeah. And Dale, I mean, that comes with the idea of, there is a process even to your submission. I mean, you don't submit to a liar, because we have to recognize that the pastor is infallible.
Jamie.
So,
hey, Jamie, how's it going?
So as long we have to realize that there are people are fallible, so that has to be taken into consideration. I mean, this is a process. It's not just I do it because this is what it is and I have to believe it. I think that's where a lot of the mistakes fall, especially here in America, where we have that religious freedom and we're able to do that in cults form out of the blue sometimes. But yeah, I mean, it's a process to me, and submission only goes so far, so
absolutely. Yeah,
would it be okay if I spoke to that question of submission? Or
yes, but I just want to check if we could, because Jamie, we're not hearing anything from you, or I don't know if you're hearing us at all, but yeah, nothing's coming. Here, check the private chat if you're hearing us. So while I'm working that out with Jamie in the private chat or by email, check your emails. David Johnson, why don't you give your take on pastoral submission?
Okay, so up until this point, I've been a really, really good boy, and I've kept my theological hat on, my Christian hat, and I've just been talking about this from the perspective of a former Christian theological geek. Here I must now remove that hat to talk about submission, because this is one of those areas where I would just disagree with the Bible. So everyone just know I'm speaking as an atheist now, and not as someone wearing a Christian hat. I do not believe in submission, period. So I think that is one of the real problems that makes that can lead to danger in religion, because there are hierarchical structures and under which there is submission. And if we take a secular example of that, the military is a hierarchical structure, and there has to be a lot of submission in order for that structure to work. Now, I'm not a soldier, but if you're a private and you receive an order that seems like a bad order to you, do you question that order? Do you disobey that order and go to jail? Or do you follow the order because you're just following orders? Well, this is a good reason why I wouldn't be in the military, because I don't think I could put myself in a system where I just had to follow orders or go to jail. I don't believe in submission. I don't believe in submission in marriage. My wife is not submissive to me, no more than what she wants to be. I certainly don't demand it. I'm an idiot. I make all kinds of mistakes. She's smarter than me in many practical ways, and so we would not be doing well if she had to submit to me in matters of domestic tranquility. That would be a really bad idea. I don't submit at work. I have bosses. I am respectful to my bosses. They tell me but I came to that job on my own free will, and there are things that I am willing to do in exchange for money. There is no order that they can give me that I would do if I was unwilling to do it. I'm not their slave. I'm their employee. So I just fundamentally don't believe in it. And so bringing it back around to the religious structure, I do not believe in submission to a pastor in particular who is telling you what is, from God somehow. Because I got communication with God too as a Christian. My spirit is just as connected to God as yours is. And so I have a very much the right as a nobody, as a lay member, to say to the clergyman who is supposedly over me, you are wrong about that. I disagree with you on that opinion. And so, no, I will not submit to that idea or that opinion. And I think the moment you give that up in religion or anything else, you are headed toward a cult-like situation. You can never give that up. And if what you're saying, David Russell, which it sounds like what you're saying, at the top of it or at bottom, whichever direction we're looking at, it's all about what is true versus who is in authority, then I agree with you, because the authority is always contingent on truth.
Right.
And when
Absolutely.
when it's subject to truth, then the authority really doesn't exist. It's it's at that point just in word only. I submit to you on the little things that don't matter, but the moment you say something that violates
And that,
truth,
yeah, David, that also comes with the caveat of like, look, I trust you to be looking after me. I'm not as wise as you in some of these areas. And it's a relationship. It's a bond more than it is a you do what I say type thing. So like, yeah, I totally agree with a lot of what you said. So continue.
Jamie, are you?
That's all I had to say. It just becomes dangerous if you become a submission machine and you give up your right to think for yourself and
Right.
exercise truth as because you are, as a Christian, I can't say this enough. This is my theological hat again. Your spiritual connection to God is no weaker than anybody else's. The preacher does not have an advantage with God over you. And so just bear that in mind. Remember that. Don't start thinking, oh, that person's closer to God than me. No, they're not.
Okay. Jamie, are you able to speak now? We saw you on video for half a second, but yep, still not. If you're talking, I'm still not hearing anything. So, okay. Okay. So yeah, just maybe David Russell, help him in the private chat. If you look at the private chat, Jamie, if you're hearing this. But anyways, while David Russell is helping Jamie in the private chat, just give him some suggestions on settings. So my take on pastoral submission, again, coming from a Christian perspective, obviously I agree with the Bible. There is a sense in which we should submit to our pastors and elders, and there are certain occasions where that's appropriate. And I think by and large, for most people, David Johnson would agree with this, that most Christians on a lay level are not as educated about what the Bible says or about the context of the Bible or the meanings of the Greek and Hebrew words and stuff like that. So there is a sense in which pastors have a knowledge about God and the Bible that most Christians in the pew don't have. So in that sense, yeah, you would want to submit to them and give due consideration to their teachings as to what the Bible says and that sort of thing. But again, I would also agree with the liberty of conscience that it's not at the expense of what you believe is true. You have to be convinced that what they're saying is true. So you're receptive and submissive to their reasoning, and you acknowledge your limitations compared to theirs and that sort of thing. But you never give this blind obedience to a pastor. That's totally wrong. And even world famous, I think it's biblical scholar Dan Wallace on Bible.org, when it comes to this Hebrews chapter 13, verses 17 to 19 text, he says, look, before we leave the subject of obedience and submission to leaders, we only submit to godly pastors. If you have an abusive or a pastor who's engaged in heresy, false teaching, or wrong behavior, abusive behaviors, or is immoral, you do not submit to that pastor. You only submit to the godly pastors, and how you determine that is based on the biblical criteria in Titus and First Timothy that Tony Costa gave us. He's not, for example, he's not quarrelsome. He's blameless, no accusations or allegations against others. He's temperate, mild-mannered. He's sensible. He's respectable in the sense that he doesn't have a bad reputation. He's hospitable. And apparently the Greek word, that means loving of those you don't know. Not violent, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not overbearing, not quick-tempered. And for anyone watching from Midland Park, I think you have to ask yourself honestly, does your pastor or does Pastor Steve fit these criteria? Or does he, not just as a one-time mistake, because we all sin, right? But in terms of a pastor, you're looking at repeated behaviors and tendencies and character traits over, is he repeatedly explosive and angry and yelling? And is he always quarrelsome? Does he repeatedly never acknowledge his own sins and blames everybody else? If you're seeing these trends where he's not fulfilling these biblical criteria, then that's where you've got to vote. He's not qualified to be a pastor. That's what you need to be looking at and following the Bible here, right? So that's what I wanted to say is submission makes sense biblically, but it's not a blind submission. It's not, oh, well, he's been trained by a seminary, therefore I just mindlessly believe everything and anything this pastor says. No, follow the Bereans. They didn't just, Paul's an apostle, way above some pitiful pastor. This is the highest office as an apostle. They didn't just believe the Apostle Paul. They went and they searched the scriptures for themselves. Does what this guy's saying make sense? Is it true? And they searched it with the help of the Holy Spirit. So, yes, we submit to our pastors. That's fully biblical, but it's not this blind obedience. That's not what submit means. And it doesn't mean that anywhere else in the Bible when it's wives submitting to their husbands, or Christ submitting to God the Father. It's not talking about this blind, mindless obedience. No, it's a biblically informed and well-considered obedience. So nothing from Jamie, or we're not hearing you. So do you maybe want to leave and then try and come back and set it up? Maybe you're not allowing. Remember, you have to click allow for your mic and video for us to hear and see you. We're not hearing anything you're saying if you're speaking right now. So maybe just leave the, maybe just leave the studio and try to log back in, and remember to click allow for your.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, you're coming through.
Okay, so I have the wrong mic setting.
No problem. Okay, awesome.
Right.
So Jamie, yeah, welcome to the show. I don't know if you've been listening to it at all. Have you heard anything we've been talking about, or?
Yeah, I heard what you said. I heard what David said, and I agree with most of it.
Okay, so yeah, what's some of your take? I'll let you have some time to give kind of an opening take on
Yeah.
various issues, submitting to pastures, this
So,
Matthew.
so for me, it's personal because I grew up um, in a very abusive Christian denomination called Independent Fundamentalist Baptists. And so the abuse that me and my family went through was horrific: spiritual, psychological, um, emotional abuse. Um, and so I have personal experience with a lot of this, right? And I think David was saying that we should not submit to authoritarian leaders or abusive leaders, and that's exactly correct. But I think we need to make the distinction um, between good pastors and bad pastors, as Dale was making, because the Bible makes that distinction. Obviously, our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ was not abusive, but he did stand up towards those who were abusive and called them out with very strong language. So uh, that's the main issue I have, and I would love to hear everybody's take on that. Is I really feel that people are not observing and reporting, and I think to let abuse continue and not to say anything, you're almost as bad as the abuser because you're enabling it. You're allowing it to continue. So that's my biggest beef within the church, is that people are afraid to speak up and report it, whether it's to the authorities or to other Christian leaders. And then we find, as Dale and I have found, that some Christian leaders have this very weird and strange approach to accountability that's not even biblical, it's not even legal, where they don't want to interfere because it's not their jurisdiction. But according to the scriptures, as I understand them, it is our jurisdiction to call out abusive pastors, Christian leaders, or abusive believers. So I'm just curious to hear what everybody else has to say about that. That's what troubles me the most. Is that people do not speak out and confront it.
Okay, so just before, just so people know, Jamie, he was a fellow member of the investigation committee into Midland Park. So and he has a ministry, as you see, Church Watchdog Ministry, where he has dealt with spiritual abuses. But David Russell has said in the private chat that he has to go to a wedding. So David, I want to turn it to you for a final word, and if you also want to address Jamie's question to you as well.
Yeah, real quick. I don't know if you can cut your mic off. I'm hearing myself in the background there. Yeah. I just wanted to say it was nice to meet you, Jamie. David, always a pleasure talking to you, buddy. You know, still love you.
I love you too.
Yeah. All right. Well, guys, it's been great. To Jamie's question, I would say this in a general term. Yes, people are scared to speak up. And this has been a problem not only in church circles, but in our history to begin with. And that's how things like the Holocaust happened. You know, as I think there's a famous mantra in the Holocaust Museum that says, you know, they came for me, or they came for this person, they came for that person, and finally they came for me. And maybe David or Dale can quote it a little better. But yeah, I mean, abuse begets more abuse, and if nobody speaks up, the abuse will continue and it will get out of hand, and you'll either find yourself leaving or you'll find yourself standing up to it. So I encourage anybody to stand up against abuse and have your own strong language for it. So that's all I got to say, guys. It's been a pleasure. Dale, thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much. Yeah, for sharing your take and stuff. Yeah, really appreciate it, buddy. And yeah, I'm sure we'll be doing future shows. So
yes, sir. Right. See you then. All right, David, take care, buddy.
All right, you too.
Cool. So yeah, at this point, I think I'll just open it up for the next little bit. Since you've come on late, I'll let you dialogue with David Johnson if you want, or are there any specific topics you wanted to engage with that we've kind of covered earlier in the show? Or
Well, before you change the topic, Jamie, I'd like to dialogue with you a little bit about the point that you brought up.
Right, yeah.
I think I absolutely agree that getting involved and speaking up is very important, and I appreciate what you do in that regard. But I think that it's not just a matter of fear that keeps people from speaking up in abusive religious situations in particular, but in other situations where there's abuse as well. I think one of the big reasons that people don't speak up sooner is that they don't realize that it's an abusive situation. There are some things that have become normalized to such a degree that it doesn't feel abusive. It's just normal. Oh, well, he always shouts after having 3 beers. He always does this thing or that. It's normal. It's how people are. My dad was that way. My uncle was that way. So that's just normal. So a woman can be in a situation where she's being abused every day and not know it because it's normalized. And the same thing happens in the church, and it can be compounded in the church because they read the Bible in a certain way. They've been taught to read the Bible in a certain way. They see certain behaviors. Well, this person is in charge. They do this thing. It doesn't seem right, but who am I? I'm submitting to the preacher. They don't even realize that there's an abusive situation going on. And so I think it's so important that we have these kinds of dialogues that we're having now to educate people on what abuse looks like. And so I think the more we can empower people by saying this type of behavior or that is abusive, or this type of situation can be abusive, keep your eyes open if you're in this situation, will really empower more people to speak up sooner. Because by the time some of the people speak up, and I believe Dale was in this situation, the abuse was already pretty bad. And I had been talking to Dale for years about this situation, and I was saying, look, you gotta get out. But for Dale, it was normalized, and it wasn't something that he had internalized as an abusive situation, I think, until later on. And I'm just glad he did. Same thing has happened to me over my life and during my religious walk and in other parts of my life. And so I just kind of wanted to make that speech and maybe dialogue or have you feedback on some of the signs of when you're in an abusive behavior and how to empower people to recognize it sooner.
Yeah, Jamie, did you want to interact with?
I think he turned his mic down before.
No, it's muted right now.
Yeah,
so just
there you go.
Unmute yourself, and you should. Or maybe you just fell asleep. You're so.
It's possible.
Jamie,
you're probably just muted. Are you able to unmute people, Dale?
Not because he's muted himself.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, I don't know what happened there. You're exactly right. The mic was muted.
Yeah.
I'm not a professional like you guys. This is only my second time doing this, but it's fun.
Absolutely.
I agreed 100% with what David said there. I was just curious. Did I hear David correctly the first time? Are you an atheist, David?
Yes.
Oh, you are?
Staunchly, but I came at it the hard way. I came at it through a lifetime of being in the church, being a minister, being involved in leadership in at least 3 different denominations. So I come by it honestly.
Yeah, that's incredible. So were you a pastor?
Once upon a time.
Wow. And what denomination, if you don't mind me asking?
Churches of Christ.
Okay.
But I've served in leadership in other denominations. The church was was my life and work, and it's all I knew really for a long
Wow.
time.
Yeah. So yeah, Jamie, anything else that you want to speak to? Because we've covered a bunch of things. So we covered the local versus universal church, the Matthew 18 process. We also covered differences between cults versus the church, and I actually played the clip you did on spiritual abuse there. So, yeah, is there anything else that you wanted to cover or go over on that front?
I really, it really resonated what David said to me. Said wasn't specifically to me, um, and I agree with it. I think a big element is what David said. People normalize it, but but together with that is also fear, because these group leaders create fear, and they engage, in gaslighting and blaming the victims for doing the abuse by even bringing it up. So, they attack us for slandering them, just for calling attention to their abusive nature, right? Um, so I definitely agree with what David said there.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so all right, so yeah, I think what's your you kind of already responded to the submitting to pastures. I'm sort of curious about the Matthew 18 process. What that was something that we heard over and over again as an excuse. Well, oh, some of the complainants or witnesses, they didn't follow Matthew 18. Um, so what do you think that's okay? Well, unless you follow that process, you can just be dismissed. What's your take on Matthew 18? Is it an absolute rule? Uh, Jamie?
Oh, is it for me?
Yeah.
I think they use Matthew 18 as an excuse to cover up their abuse. Because Matthew 18 is actually talking about the opposite thing. It's talking about how to deal with abuse, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know how they're twisting that to mean that because people didn't follow that, then somehow they're scotch free. So, and this is the issue with the church. I think David brought it up. I think the distinction I would make is that because I believe in God, God cannot abuse because he's perfect and holy. So the element of the church that abuses is really the human element. And that human element really transcends religion, because you see as much abuse or more abuse within government or business or just in life in general. When you look at different government regimes of the past, they were a lot more abusive than the church has ever been. So I don't see Jesus Christ being abusive. I see him confronting abusers like the Pharisees. But his message was one of love and mercy and justice. And he says, you've overlooked the more important matters of the law. You're so concerned about people and doctrines and rules and regulations. You miss what the gospel is all about. It's about justice and mercy and honesty and integrity. And that's what he authenticated in his life.
You know,
So I make the distinction between who's doing the abusing. I don't think God could ever abuse. It's human beings who are corrupt, and they're using religion as a mechanism to perpetuate their abuse. But I mean, abuse is everywhere. If we remove religion and we didn't have religion, there would still be as much abuse as there is with religion. So I don't know if David or Dale want to respond to that.
well,
That's sort of my perspective, is for people within the church to see the difference between people abusing and how they may be abusing the scriptures.
Well, here's something that we haven't covered at all, but it's something that I know this is your area of expertise where you really came in handy. So it's regarding the church or the cult, whatever it is, and the relationship to the law of the land. Now, I have a clip from Pastor Steve at Midland Park that I was going to use it as an example where he kind of uses the pulpit as a bully pulpit, right? Where if he's having a private disagreement with someone, he will always use the safety of his pulpit to uh, kind of attack that position or whatever. But so this is an example where he's doing that in relation to the fact that our committee discovered certain problematic elements in accordance with charity laws, and that where the pastor, he's not supposed to be on the board and he's not supposed to be handling money. So here's an example of a clip. I'll just play a clip of him where he's inserting this. It has nothing to do with his sermon in general, but he inserts this aspect to defend himself on this private debate, but it deals with this the role of the church in relation to the law of the land. So that's actually a topic I'd like to discuss. So let me just bring that up here. Is that popping up? Can you guys see that?
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay, so I'm just going to play this little 5-minute clip or so, but he's talking about, he's trying to defend the fact that the pastor is handling the money, and apparently in Canada under charity laws this is a no-no, but here he is trying to defend himself.
Who are his own countrymen, the Jews, they feel at least they can do in return is to help them financially. As soon as I have delivered this money and completed this good deed of theirs,
Are you able to turn it up, Dale?
way to Spain and
I think it's at 100%.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
I'm at 100%, unfortunately.
Okay, that's fine.
So,
I'm sure that when I come, Christ will richly bless our time together. This is so beautiful, Paul is saying. I can't miss this. All of you heard of a treasurer? You know, missionaries are not supposed to be doing money business. Paul, you're a missionary. You're not part of the financial team, so leave that money to them. See, there are many things that we're doing right now. They're actually man-made if we only realize and go to the scripture that these things are the standard. Pastors now handling the money of the church. That's anathema. But let me ask you, point me a verse in scripture that says otherwise. Because I can point you many verses in scripture to tell you that the ministry of the word of God includes both needs of the human being. It is a holistic ministry.
okay, so that's basically the clip, and I love his little challenge. Point to me a single verse that says it's wrong. Okay, Romans chapter 13, where you are to obey the governing authorities. Paul didn't live in 21st century Canada with the charity laws that apply to you, Pastor Steve, that didn't apply in the ancient Roman Empire. There's your verse. You're not, according to our findings, you're not complying with the law, and Paul orders you as a pastor to obey the law. So there's your verse.
But you could also have a counter verse, excuse me, where Peter says you ought to obey God rather than man in a sense of civil disobedience. So the law tells you to do something or prohibits you from doing something that God wants you to do. Then the choice is to obey God rather than man, and to take the penalty and go to jail or whatever. So I think that the other side of that equation, from a simply theological point of view, has the stronger piece of the argument.
I don't think so, because I mean, what is against Scripture in setting up a board of trustees or whatever, as the law prescribes, to handle the money of the church? Why does it have to be the pastor who's handling?
Can I step in here, Dale?
Yeah, Jay, this is your expertise, Jay.
Yeah, it's sort of my expertise. I found some other verses to support that. What David is saying is correct, but I don't think it applies here, because I think it's dealing more with moral issues where the church disagrees with the secular moral issues. We're protected then, right? Like we've talked about this before, Dale, where if a gay couple wants to rent the hall of a church, the church can refuse them. And they can claim discrimination, but they're protected because of their core values, which disagrees with that. I think that's what it's talking more about. What David quoted.
Just to be clear, this was a place where, Peter was preaching Jesus, and they were saying, "I charged you not to preach in this man's name. And Peter said, we're compelled to do so. We're compelled to do so. We ought to obey God rather than man. So that was the particular context of that quote. I'm not saying that it could not apply to other laws, but
that's important.
specifically to things regarding, how Christians are to do their Christian duty according to God.
That's the context. You would be correct, David. Yeah, you'd be correct. I think that the Bible verse that would contradict all of this is Acts 6:2-4, where it says, "Then the 12 summoned the whole company of the disciples and said, 'It would not be right for us to give up preaching about God to handle financial matters. Therefore, brothers, select among you 7 men, deacons of good reputation, full of the Spirit, wisdom, whom ye may appoint for this duty. But we will devote ourselves to prayer and to the preaching of the ministry.'" And that's from Holman's Christian Standard Bible that uses the word pastors or elders are not supposed to be involved in the financial. Another version says administrative matters of the church. And that's the whole reason why they elected deacons. So there's a verse right there that completely supports charity law or nonprofit law.
I completely agree with you in the battle of the verses. I think that is the place to go to. All I was suggesting was you can't have a blanket, whether it's Romans 13 saying you ought to obey the government, because the government's evil. It's going to, it can outlaw Christianity. Therefore, you can't be Christian. So you can't have a blanket thing there, and you also can't have a blanket thing of saying, well, I'm going to just disobey all laws because I'm a Christian. And so when speaking to the specific situation that you're dealing with, Acts 6 is a brilliant go-to there. Acts 7.
Yeah, but David's point is well taken, and it's absolutely correct. You need that balance. There's also 1 Peter 2:13-17, where it talks about that we're supposed to submit to human institutions or governments, to the emperor, and also Titus 3:1-2, where it tells us to submit to the rulers and authorities, to be obedient to them. And it's interesting to me that that Titus passage talks about not speaking evil of anyone, or avoiding being quarrelsome or gentle, and to show courtesy towards all people, which are qualifications for a pastor. And also the Romans passage, I just want to point out that it says that if we refuse to obey the government, then we're basically refusing to obey God, because God put the government there to punish evildoers. And it's interesting to me, that word evildoers, because it's connected to abuse of people. So it says if you do good, you'll be praised by the government, but if you do evil, you'll be corrected. And that's why God instituted the government. So it's almost like the government has the jurisdiction over the church to correct them when there's abuse, according to these passages.
That is a very difficult teaching, and I just want to pick your brain and ask you a question regarding that. So when the churches of Christ, the more conservative flavors of the churches of Christ, which I was involved with early on, they wanted their tax exempt status. So they wanted to be as 501c3.
One thing just to say here, because Jamie, he's in Toronto with me in Canada, so there may be a difference between U.S. and Canada, but I don't know.
Right. I'll say the things that are relevant, but that won't be relevant to this example.
Okay.
I'm having a hard time hearing David for some reason. It's very
I'm sorry.
faint. Is that my fault? It's up my end.
I wouldn't say it's your fault. Dale, can you hear me? Okay.
I can hear you. Yeah.
Okay, Jamie, maybe it's your fault.
Is there anything you can help me with, Dale, to put up my volume somehow? Because I've tried.
In terms
I can hear you okay, but David's very faint.
Okay. Well, that's weird then. Maybe it may be on David's end then. If you can hear me perfectly fine.
Yeah, I can hear you loud. Yeah. Okay, I'll try and listen closely.
All right. I'll try. I'm going to overdrive my microphone if I speak too much louder.
That's better.
I will try.
Yeah.
All right. So, nonprofit status. I don't know what the status of churches are in Canada, but as a nonprofit, you don't have to pay taxes. That's
right.
The essential thing. And churches want to not have to pay taxes. And so in my denomination, they had a little bit of a problem with that, because in order to maintain that tax exempt status, you needed to have a board and trustees and bylaws and things like
Right.
that.
Right.
And so the church, what the more conservative of them said was, no, we don't want to do that. There's nothing we can't let the state dictate the polity of the church in leadership and various roles. We're not going to invent a new role of trustee, and
Right,
things
right.
like that to satisfy the government. This is the church of God. This is not the church of government.
Right.
And so this was one of those situations where they were saying, well, we ought to obey God rather than man. And what I would say is you ought to pay your taxes.
I
And
agree.
if you want to do that. But this is kind of where I think the preacher at this church was going. And I don't want to sound like I'm defending this guy, but he's thinking whatever's in his mind that it is okay. It is, whether it is necessary or not, it's okay for preachers to handle finances in special situations. Fine. I have no problem granting him that. And he's saying, well, Canadian law says it's not okay. And Canada doesn't get to make laws with regard to the biblical roles of pastors. So I understand how he could get tied up into that. And it's kind of a slippery slope type thing. Okay, we give into that, and the next thing you know, the church doesn't look anything like the church, and we're saluting to the government. We've got to run things by the government before we can do disciplinary actions. There have been lawsuits over church discipline because churches followed a biblical example, and they were sued, and they had to pay a lot of money. That's something that I was close to once upon a time.
Are you at liberty to give some general principles without disclosing names? I'm very interested in what you said.
Yeah, there was a lady, I think that she was, having maybe an adulterous relationship or called an adultery or something like that, and this was brought to the church. The church kind of made it public through their process of discipline, and she sued them, and she won $8 million, as I recall.
Really?
Yes, and from a civic perspective, she should have won. She absolutely should have won. The church had no business doing that.
How were they disciplining her?
I don't know. I don't know that. So some process by which this was, taken to, someone confronted her. It was taken to, some people in the church, taken to the elders. The elders escalated it, something like that. Some Matthew 18 type of
and she won.
Attempt to do. Oh yeah, she won $8 million.
Wow. Was she an employee that was of the church?
I do not know that detail.
Okay, because
civically, she should have won. The law was such where I agree with the law on that. However, that's irrelevant because the church is the church, and the church has its process. And the church, I don't think they ever did that again, by the way. But what the church should say is, well, look, this is how, if they believe that they were following the right path that was laid out from the Bible, then they ought to do it and get sued every time, or they ought to fold. And so that's kind of the difficulty here, and I think that's where this pastor's tie up is.
Jamie, I want to turn it to you because what I think it might be helpful for those in the audience. Again, understand you're a Canadian, so it might not apply in the U.S., but it's probably similar. What are, in terms of from a legal perspective, charity law and that sort of thing, what are some of the things that we should know about the power and role of a pastor in a church? Like, is he an employee?
We've commissioned a expert on this, so we've gotten educated, and the laws in Canada might be different. I just find it, I would love to know the details of what David had mentioned, because adultery, if she's having an adulterous relationship, that would go against the core values of the Christian faith, which would not be considered discrimination, according to the lawyer that we talked to. So the church cannot discipline based on arbitrary reasons or personal reasons. but they can discipline based on biblical core values of the Christian faith. I'm not talking about non-essentials. I'm talking about, I mean, adultery would be considered, along with homosexuality and some other, common law, for instance. The church would have warranted uh, ability to discipline people as long as the discipline was not excessive.
Yeah, I don't think the discipline. I don't think the suit had to do with the fact that the church disciplined her per se. Now I'd have to
Okay.
look this up. This is a long time ago.
Yeah,
I think it
yeah.
had to do with publicizing the situation.
Oh, yeah, 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 yeah.
And putting a scarlet letter on her. For
Yeah,
whatever
that would
reason.
make sense. It would be defamation. They try to
Yes.
embarrass her. Okay, so that answers the question. Yeah, that's very good. Later on, I don't know if this is probably not the appropriate time to do this, but I will answer Dale's question. I'm just fascinated with David's background. I think he's an incredible resource. So maybe later we can do this, Dale, if you can remember. I would like to know more about
Well, I was
David's experience within the Church of Christ. And right now, my memory is failing me, but I used to know this. There's a difference between the Church of Christ and the Church of God. And
Yes.
I know, according to evangelicals like Walter Martin in his book Kingdom of the Cults, one of them is a cult, and I think it's the Church of God, not the Church
Yes.
of Christ. Is that correct, David?
That is correct. The Church of Christ is not generally considered a cult
Right.
by other churches. I consider it a
The
cult.
Church of God is, though.
But yeah, the Church of God is often considered a cult, but that's not universal.
Yeah, and I agree with David. I think there's mainstream churches that are not traditional cults, but they're operating as cults because they have a cult-like leader or cult-like doctrine. So, for instance, a good church could have a good pastor one day, and the next day they get, well, I'm not going to use this word because I don't want to get a lawsuit, but let's just say an abusive pastor, right? To keep it professional, and the church changes from a good church to an abusive church. But okay, so you've clarified that it's the Church of God that is considered a traditional cult.
Yes.
Yeah. So what was your question, Dale? Because I think it was an important one.
Yeah, so I think it's important for the audience to understand, at least to the extent that from our consultations with lawyers and experts in charity law and church law and that sort of thing, what is exactly legally the role of the pastor and how they govern the church? What are some of the things from a legal perspective?
Yeah. So I'm, like I told you, I grew up in an extremely abusive denomination. I've been researching the topic of spiritual abuse for like over 30 years now. So people, in the know-how consider me a layman expert on spiritual abuse. And so that's why I wanted to make that clarification with David about the two churches. So legally in Canada, a church that's registered as a charity. So David could probably respond to this from the state's perspective, but there are denominations, and I want to say the Gospel Hall, but I'm not 100% sure. But there are certain denominations that refuse to get involved with the government, so they don't even have charitable status, so they don't have to worry about that. They can operate whichever way they want. At the same time, they're still not above the law if they're abusing people. Or committing criminal offenses. They can't wash their hands like Pilate and say we're innocent. You know what I mean? If you break the speed limit, and you're going to tell a police officer, well, don't judge me. Well, he's still going to give you a ticket, right? So there's still criminal codes and human rights violations that a church that's not registered as a charity can violate, and they can still be in trouble for that. But specifically, if you are a charity, then you have to respect. And I would use David's word. You have to submit. It's their rules. You're playing by, not our rules. So if you're going to consider yourself a Christian charity and you're registered with the government as such, you have to submit. And if you don't want to submit, then unregister as a charity. It's as simple as that. And the problem I have, which I think all three people here, David and Dale, would agree with, is that it really bothers me that a lot of churches, if not the majority of churches, are running like personal businesses. And then they're laughing and getting tax breaks, which I disagree with. I think they should pay their taxes, and they should not be a charity. And there are cases where the charity directorate, I'm not sure what it would be called in the States, he's the only one that can remove their charitable status. And it might happen in this case with this particular church. There are case studies where that has happened. If you violate charity laws or you commit financial fraud, then you deserve to get what you get, like anybody else, like any other charity. So, where I would like to get David's perspective, because of his ministry background, is David, would you see a difference? Because I really don't necessarily. There's some exceptions that you brought up with a secular charity and a religious charity, because there's a lot of similarities. They would call it the CEO. So the CEO of a company, because I've worked for secular charities, for instance, he cannot be on the board. And he would have a financial allowance that he can use, but he would manage the organization and the board of directors would govern. And he would not be on the board of directors because it would be seen as a conflict of interest with his salary or evaluations or even his firing. So how would you see that, David, in comparison with a church? Like, I know a church has different beliefs from a secular charity that might exempt it in some areas, but regardless, if you're a charity, you would have to abide by charity laws, whether you're secular or religious. So just wanted to get David's take on that.
Sure. The U.S. is weird, and it's been a long time since I've dealt with this in that close of a way. So just some caveats. But part of the weirdness of the U.S. is how we deal with churches. Churches have a very special status
Right.
here, and it's not the same as any nonprofit corporation, a 501c3. So they are that, but they're more than that, and they have some exemptions, and there are places where the lines cross, and it gets very muddy. So one example of that is any nonprofit corporation has to open their books to the IRS.
Yes.
And the public. Frankly, you've got to. It's your finances have to be an open book,
right? Except
with churches. Churches don't have to open up anything. They don't have to disclose anything about finances.
And that's in the States.
In the States.
It's my understanding that's not the case here in Canada.
Right. So that's why I say it's a very interesting relationship that the church has with the government. The government is very, very careful, overly careful, in my opinion, not to regulate religion. But
can I just add something? Can I just add? Sorry to interrupt you, David. Can I add something to that? Do you think it's because of the strong emphasis in the United States, which we don't have here in Canada, on separation of church and state?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's a part of that, and I think that there is a fear, a reactionary fear, that if the state does anything that impinges upon a church's right, then they're going to stay as far away from it as possible. And so things like hiring discrimination does not apply to churches. They can discriminate as much as they want to because they have their own policies and so forth. And so you can't make me hire a gay person.
Well, yeah, that's an excellent point, because that would apply here in Canada as well. Like, because that's a core value of, let's say, traditional Christians.
Right, but being a racist is a core value of a Klansman. That would not be considered by law the same thing as, a church not, in their views on gays. So we would take that and say, yes, we must consider that. But we wouldn't take a Klansman's view on racism and say, yes, we must consider that for that organization. It's a special relationship. And so it kind of defies easy explanations of what their responsibility is toward the law. It's very loosey-goosey. And there are very few things that I could say about the law and regular nonprofit corporations that would blanketly apply to a church.
Well, that's interesting, David, because I wasn't fully aware of that. I was aware of some of it. So in Canada, it's the CRA. What did you call it in the States?
The IRS.
The IRS.
IRS.
Okay, so they
Internal
wouldn't have
Revenue Service. They're the big.
So they would have no jurisdiction over churches.
Not really. I mean, yes and no. I mean, the IRS put Capone in prison. So the IRS has all kinds of power. Everybody's afraid of the IRS.
Yeah.
But churches, once again, have that special relationship with the government, and it's really, really hard to define. And so things that apply to other nonprofit corporations do not necessarily apply to churches. And
Right.
churches can simply get away with more stuff, and nobody presses that button.
Yeah, but
Okay.
we've heard here in Canada, and you would probably be more aware of this, like when the whole Jim Baker thing happened. I mean, that was fraud. So how how was that? How were they able to get him on that?
I don't know because look, there's fraud. There are things like here's an example: embezzlement. What
Right.
is embezzlement? It's taking money under false pretenses. Let's just oversimplify it
Right.
there. But one could argue, were one to be a bit churlish here, that any church taking up a collection on behalf of God is embezzlement, because now you've got to prove that God wanted that money. Well, a church doesn't have to prove that. A church can take up money under any pretenses they want to, almost. Now, if they say, I mean, and preachers do this all the time. They will get on TV and say, "I need another jet,"
Right.
and people will give them money. Or sometimes they will say, "My ministry needs money," without saying they need another jet, and they'll buy another
Yeah.
jet. That's not embezzlement. You cannot throw a televangelist, or at least it's very hard to throw a televangelist in jail because they embezzled some money. And
That's
under what another business it might be called embezzlement, but we
yeah.
have this religious protection. We can define it in a certain way, and so how do
Okay.
you how do you prosecute that?
Okay, so I'm going to step in here. We are at the 3 hour mark, but Jamie, one last question for you. So
Yeah.
outside of
Can I just respond to something David said, because that's fascinating to me, because I think the rules in Canada regarding financial accountability for churches is a lot stricter than in the States. Obviously, both in the States and Canada, no church would be above the criminal code. So if you
Right.
commit a criminal offense or human rights, but again, churches are exempt from a lot of human rights, as David well said. But like
Mm,
I'll give you just a quick example that happened with the situation with the church that Dale's talking about, where there was discrimination based on Muslim people using the facility of the church for their ESL classes, right? So that, according to Canadian law, I'm not sure how the states would see that, would be discrimination on the basis of them discriminating against them using the facility for community purposes. So anyway,
Yeah,
that's just
that
one
would be
example.
discrimination here.
Yeah. Anyway,
okay, so yes, Jamie, just one last question for you again about this. What about forget about money and the taxes and stuff now? What about the role of the government to talk about the structure of the church or the governance, how it's structured? Do you know any? Do you
you're
have
talking about charity law.
Yeah, like
Yeah.
under like the board
Yeah,
of trustees.
so like it's to me, it's a no-brainer. If you're a registered charity, then you have to submit to the administrative or guidelines of the government, as long as it's not violating your faith. Like the lawyer we commissioned made it very clear that you can't discipline and you can't run a church at arbitrary um, basis. It has to be on core Christian beliefs, and that's the only thing that will give you exemption. But arbitrary or personal reasons gives the court an opportunity to step in and take action. And so that's the difference. I'm not sure how it would work in the States, but for instance, like a CEO or pastor cannot be on the board. It's a conflict of interest. And how can they be in charge of the finances of the whole church? Now, they can be in charge of the finances that the board provides for them. So what the lawyer mentioned to us is like a frontline staff, whether it's religious or secular, they manage the organization. So they're going to have an allowance of money that they can manage, that the board of directors or trustees provides for them, right? And that's what a budget comes in place. But they do not have the authority legally in Canada anyway, or scripturally, to be running the governance of the church, because the church doesn't belong to one person. It belongs ultimately to God, if you believe in God, or to the members of the whole church, not to one person. And that's where we get into cult-like groups.
So, Jamie,
Well,
I would love to talk to you more about this. I know that Dale is trying to get us out of here. And
yeah,
so
No,
I
well,
do
I find
respect
your
that.
background fascinating, David.
Let me
Well, here's
ask. Can I
well,
ask Jamie just one more question
Go
on
ahead,
this
David.
on this topic? On this topic.
well, I was about to say I was thinking because Jamie's wanting to come back on my show 3 times and to continue on about spiritual abuse. So I
Yeah,
was
I have time now to continue, but I don't know if you guys can continue.
okay. You. It's up to David.
I can
Johnson.
make it happen.
Okay, yeah, because
Okay.
I have a lot of questions for you,
I
David.
love talking to interesting
We'll have to
people.
do that
Okay,
some other time.
So,
I'll get
so
out of
let
your
me-
way. Yeah, I'll
so-
keep it going for a bit and let you guys keep going then.
Okay.
Okay, so
David had a question.
before David, you ask your question then.
Mhm.
I just want to clarify something about the Muslim thing because that's testimony from my mom. She was in charge and teaching the ESL kids. So I do just want to clarify so that it's fair and stuff in case anyone from Midland Park is listening, that what Steve's issue was there is that he didn't like the church building being used expressly for the purpose of teaching English to Muslims, and that was it. He said that there had to be an evangelistic main purpose, that we were evangelizing them if they were using the church building. So just to clarify, that's my understanding of what was happening. It's not that he was discriminating against Muslims because they were Muslims. It was the use of the building kind of thing. So that's the only clarification. But yeah, other than that, I'll get out of your guys' way and I'll let you guys go for next little bit. How long do you guys want to keep going?
Just
Well, as long
give
as
us
you have.
just give us a couple of minutes anyway.
No,
I
I can go on.
I have I do have another commitment, but I'm pushing it off because I don't want to end so abruptly. We just got Jamie, and
No problem. Yeah, I'll
I
let you
talk
guys
to
go
the
up to another 4-hour mark if you
no,
guys.
No.
I don't know that it would be necessary to do that. But let me just try this question
Yeah.
because it is relevant to, I think, the main point here, which was about the legality of it. And so this was one of the angles. You know, this pastor, I don't even know his name. I didn't bother to remember the name of the person who's in question here, but that you guys are investigating. But this pastor, so you're saying that he did something illegal, and therefore that should be one reason why he should be disciplined by the church or some such. And I just wanted to double back around to this.
Yeah.
I agree with you to a point, and I'm saying this with my Christian hat on. He, in his mind, and I'm just going to take him at his word, based on the clip that Dale played. He, in his mind, is doing something that he believes the Bible not only allows him to do, but maybe requires him to do. Okay, he can be wrong about that, but that's his religious belief. That's his sincerely held religious belief. And so he is saying the government is stopping our church from functioning the way God intended to function, and therefore I will disobey the government and do that. Under that situation, I would think that he's right. And so the objection that he's doing something illegal would not be grounds for this, because there are many illegal things he could do where you as Christians should say, right on, I'm glad you did that. Because you're honoring God by doing that. So I'm just wondering, Jamie, where are some of the lines drawn for you where you wouldn't say the legality of this has an issue? Because I'm not sure that it does.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, David, but I would rather, like, I can mention to you specifics, which the police have confirmed, which the human rights have confirmed, which the CRA has confirmed regarding charity law violations and financial violations. But I'd rather not mention specifics because it's an ongoing case.
I understand.
So there are specific things that we haven't said. The authorities have said is illegal,
Right.
and so they're doing their own investigation. Maybe a year from now, when the investigation is concluded from the government's perspective, because our investigation is done, but now the government in Canada, now the CRA and the public office, we call it, of the trustee and guardian, have started their own investigations. So I'd rather not disclose any specifics. Maybe we shouldn't have disclosed that. I apologize about your mom.
Well, I respect that.
Yeah. So there's
I
specifics
didn't
that
know.
the authorities have said are violations, regardless if they're a church or not.
Well, let's just make it a hypothetical then.
Sure.
Let's say that the government ruled that all churches of a certain size have to have at least one female and one male pastor.
Yeah,
That's
a good point.
Something like that. And I don't know what your personal views are. It doesn't matter. I don't even care what is right biblically. Let's just say that your church believes that there should be no female pastors. Yeah. Should you obey the law and put up some kind of figurehead and call her a pastor, or should you defy it?
Yeah, that's one of the best questions I've ever heard on this issue. And you know what I'm going to tell you, David? I'm going to be honest. I don't know. I don't know. I would have to think about that some more.
I don't either.
I don't. That's an excellent question. I really don't know, because as far as secular charities are concerned, they have to have a certain ratio. And I think, why should the church be exempt from that? I don't think they should, from one perspective. But as you all said, there are some denominations that only believe males can be pastors. So I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, I know that mine didn't allow for women pastors at all. But I can tell you, if I were in that position today and leading a church like that, and the law turned that way, I would not fold my church, nor would I subject all of my members to go to jail. And so I would probably, this is just me spitballing, I would probably try to find some way to set up some type of figurehead.
Yeah,
to satisfy the law.
Can I give my answer? Because
yeah,
it's different than both of you guys. I think that the Bible is clear that when it comes to obeying man-made authorities or obeying God's laws, you obey God's kind of thing. But there is an out in this case, right? Because the out is, I'm assuming, to be a charity, you have to have a man and a woman pastor. Okay, I won't be a charity then. That's the path you should take in that case, right? But
then you've got to open up your books, and you're just a business at that point. No church wants to operate like that.
They don't want to, but that's what you'd have to do. If you're if the government gives you that law that you have to do that, and the Bible says you can't do that, then the choice you should make is, fine, I'm not going to get the benefits of being a charity then, because...
Yeah, so Dale, I want to say something to that just came into my mind, because and you guys might disagree with this, but I do not see that issue as an essential of the Christian faith. I would see it as a non-essential, where we would have liberty to disagree. I think on core, like the lawyer told us, core Christian values, which would be essentials of the Christian faith, and we can talk about those some other time. Like, for instance, on the issue, I'll bring it up, of homosexuality, I personally believe that's an essential of the Christian faith, because the Bible is so dogmatic on that issue, right? Obviously, different people take a different take on that. We know there's churches with homosexual ministers, right? And they embrace that. I just see that as being in bed with the culture morally. But anyway, that's beside the point. The point is that I see David's example as a non-essential of the Christian faith. And the way I would see it is, how does the majority of the church see the essentials and see the non-essentials? Because you have certain denominations which are traditional cults, and then, like David well said, you have then traditional, or depending on the specific church, that are operating like a cult. But that is where, and I'd love to talk about that, because David comes from the Church of Christ, so they would have a hierarchy or a fellowship that you could report the church to. And we've done our investigation at our end that proper fellowships here in Canada, there are cases where they have stepped in and removed the pastor. So the people have complained because the deacons weren't able to remove the pastor, or the board wasn't able to remove the pastor for whatever reason. Maybe the pastor has hijacked the board or the finances. So they went to the fellowship or the hierarchy, that the umbrella organization that the church is under, and they have stepped in and removed the pastor. So I'd love to get your feedback on that, David.
Sure, I can say it in two quick ways. One, the Church of Christ does not have a hierarchy, and so
Okay,
it's
so I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah, it's independent and congregational, so there's nowhere to appeal to.
But don't they have in Canada? The Church of Christ has like a director that would go to the church. He doesn't have authority.
There are many flavors of the Church of Christ.
Okay, that's why.
So,
Okay.
Yeah, so in the U.S., the mainline Church of Christ, and I'm just speaking of that, there are 5 branches that I could talk about, but the mainline Church of Christ is very congregational, and there's no hierarchy.
Right.
If you get into the Disciples of Christ or the Christian Church, then you could get into some hierarchical flavors. So, you could be thinking about that as well. But the second part of that is the reality of the Churches of Christ is, even though we have a similar to the Baptist teaching on elders and deacons, I think also probably similar to the Baptist, most churches do not have elders or deacons. Most churches are small churches. These things apply to large churches usually. And so the preacher, and this is one of the distinctions that's different from Baptists and Churches of Christ, in almost every other denomination, the preacher is considered the pastor. In fact, they're called the pastor. That's their title. That's a title for elders, bishops, pastors, shepherds. It's the same word. The Church of Christ makes a distinction between the pulpit preacher and the elders. Okay. And so most of the churches, which are smaller, have preachers and no elders. And so the preacher is the de facto pastor, if you will. There is no one who can remove him.
Wow.
And if the Church of Christ, let's say as an independent pastor, an evangelist, you go out and you start a church. Okay, you're very enthusiastic. You plant a church. You start it off in a storefront. You get it going, and you eventually buy a building. You have started a church. You are the pastor. There are, by definition, almost no elders possible in that church.
Is that right?
Because
so
you started it.
The pastor's God Almighty.
Well, kind of. But, I mean, if you think about it from a practical perspective, you started a church. You got 20 or 30 followers who are behind you. Who's qualified to be an elder? There are no people qualified to be an elder. You just baptize 20 people. You are the highest authority there. Even if you wanted to elect some pastors or deacons, you can't do it because all of your congregants, once again, by definition, are new. So
there's you're saying there's no accountability.
There can be no accountability,
right.
and I would also argue that this is largely how churches work, even in denominations. Baptist churches spring up all the time because people go out and they start a church. They're independent churches. Happens all the time. Are we going to say it's wrong to plant a church? There's lots of conversations that can be had about how should churches be planted. Well, maybe this other church that is established and has elders, they send out evangelists, they plant a church. I've seen that model too. We have that in the Churches of Christ. And then you get this confusing thing of this new church, which is a separate entity because it's a church, is now under the eldership of this other church.
No,
and what happens if this other church plants a lot of churches in the community and throughout? They are kind of the bishopric at that point, are they not? Because all of these places are seeded from that church. So you either have some kind of bishopric, which is this big church that seeded all these little churches, or you acknowledge that these little churches are independent fellowships and they cannot have elders because they're new and young. You can't have it both ways.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I didn't know that dynamics about the Church of Christ, because my personal belief in researching this subject for a long time, and it's fine if people disagree with it, but I just don't see any other biblical way around it, is that I don't believe independent churches are biblical. I think a church is not independent by definition; it's interdependent, and so. I think there needs to be that accountability. There needs to be that fellowship that legally can step in, where the president comes in and says, "You're gone. You got all these complaints," and they have the legal right to remove that pastor. And that's the case here in Canada with some of our Christian fellowships, is they have that jurisdiction to remove a pastor once allegations come to the forefront. So I don't agree with independent churches that do not have the proper hierarchy or accountability. I don't think they're even a church biblically.
I don't know
think they're
that
a
I
cult.
can disagree with you.
They're a cult.
Yeah,
You know,
I can't really disagree with you on that, but
Can I ask you?
yeah, we could talk for hours on it.
yeah, but then we have the traditional cults. and they
Wait,
have,
Jamie, I've got a question.
yeah, you got to go.
Follow-up question. Okay, so we're almost at the 3.5 hour mark, but okay, so what do we do? Let's say we do have these presidents and stuff, but what if they're the problem? Because that, I mean, we see with the Catholic Church,
Yeah,
the popes are the problem. They have this hierarchy. So what would we do if the president is the problem and he's the one that's corrupt and stuff? Like, should there be an even higher? Yeah, I'm just wondering if there's an issue on that end.
Let me jump out first, because I can't dishonor my commitments for too long. So that said, Jamie, get in touch. I want to hear on the show so that we can talk about some of this stuff. I'm a theological wonk, always have been, even on this side of the aisle, and so I would love to nerd out about some of this stuff. And I know I've got an audience that would love to hear that. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Yeah, it's a pleasure talking to you, David. I think you're a great resource. And something came into my brain while you were talking.
Mm-hmm.
And Dale, I hope you don't take this the wrong way, but I think I can say that I'm probably an atheist when it comes to independent churches, or I'm an atheist when it comes to cults. I would be a believer when it comes to proper churches under the proper authority with the proper structure and accountability. But I definitely do not, and what I was trying to get at is those traditional cults that have all the infrastructure and they're still cults because at the top they're corrupt, right? But there's always hope, because you've heard of the Herbert Armstrong. Well, supposedly, I don't know how much you've heard about that, David, but supposedly they were a traditional cult, and their leadership has changed their mind on that, and they've come around now to change some of their views. Have you heard anything about that?
No, I haven't. That is fascinating.
Yeah, it's the Worldwide Church of God, I believe it is, and it was and there was an apologist on WDCX who mentioned that, who was a part of that. I think John MacArthur was a part of that. Some of his teachings helped them, and that's a huge infrastructure where they turned around.
Yeah, Clint was, now that I recall, Clint, a friend of mine, a fellow ex-pastor, was telling me something about this. Yeah, that's, we'll probably end up doing a show about that.
Clint, and I'm like you too, David. I'm not an atheist per se. Like I said, I'm an atheist when it comes to cults, and I don't believe in their God. I don't believe in that kind of God. So I'm an atheist when it comes to that. I don't believe in the God that abuses. I don't believe in the God of independent churches, all that kind of stuff. But I do see that I make the distinction between good churches and bad churches. But I'm an ex-pastor as well, so I think we have something in common there.
There you go.
Yeah.
All right.
By the way, for the record, I would never, ever in a million years, even if you gave me $1 billion, ever become a pastor, because I don't like it. I don't like the politics. I don't like hearing people's problems. I don't like the pressure. I don't like it. It's not me.
Look, no worries. I'm not in danger of giving you $1 billion. So look,
I'm exaggerating, but
we have Mr.
Jetty.
Be able
to give you $1 million.
Saying, okay, guys, we have Mr. Jetty saying church watchdog and non-believer. So there you go, Jamie. You've ruined your reputation.
But this is about protecting people from dangerous cult-like situations. And so the thing that I kind of want to piece out on here is I don't, at the end of the day, all of the talk about procedure in, reporting an abuser, or church discipline in the process of Matthew 18 or First and Second Corinthians, the process of excommunication. All of that is academic,
Right.
because at the end of the day, that's not how the church operates. That's not how people operate. And so you can say, well, but biblically, this is how it's supposed to operate. It doesn't matter. That's not good. Saying that is not going to protect people from abusive situations. And so what we have to do is help educate people on what a proper church relationship is, and help them realize when abuse might be occurring, and empower them to talk about that, and get out. Because the most important thing for a member in that situation is not to take that preacher down. The most important thing is for you to protect yourself and your family, and go to a church that is healthy. And from that place of a healthy church, you can then get the word out about some of the ill health that was there.
Well said.
But, so it would be great if there was a procedure, a biblical procedure that, was effective in all situations, and that you could work from the inside and make this work. It's just not the reality. Protect yourself, and then protect others by talking about your experience at this place and letting people know. You don't even have to say that's a cult or that's an abusive situation. You can let them know the exact details of the situation you were in, and let them judge for themselves whether or not they should be a member of that. But rule number one in any potentially abusive situation: get out, protect yourself, protect your family, and then work from a place of safety to make that other poisonous situation better if you can.
All right. All right, cool. Jamie, I'll let you have
Very well said, David. David, are you familiar with the atheist churches?
come on, guys.
Okay, look, I'm gonna for Dale's sake, I'm going to not answer that.
I'm losing control of my own show.
It's for next time.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, sounds good. So yeah, like David said, he kind of took my thunder with his closing statement. But I was gonna say the motivation for this show was to be an edifying purpose. It was to help people in Midland Park, if you're there, to consider and do your duty as a Christian to do God's will, but also for other people that might be in similar situations where you're not sure if you're in a cult or not, and how you can go about adjudicating that and realize what to do in that purpose. So that was the goal of this show, to provide that edifying purpose. So yeah, thank you everybody for listening, and have a great week. All right.